Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to start the series on the Slav defense. One of the main and most popular and best responses to pawn to d4, so one of the main defenses to the queen's pawn opening, and one of the oldest and the most theoretical as well. This is the starting position of the Slav defense. It starts after the queen's gambit, so when white plays the move d4, Black responds classically with the move d5, and white plays the queen's gambit with pawn to c4. After pawn to c4, there are several possibilities black could choose from. Of course, taking is one of them, accepting the gambit. Playing e6 is probably the most popular response, that's the queen's gambit declined. And the third, or the second most popular, is the Slav defense with pawn to c6. Now, what is the difference between the Slav defense and the queen's gambit decline? Seemingly, both moves serve the same purpose, so e6 and c6 both simply support the d5 pawn. If black didn't support the d5 pawn, let's say he tries to play something else, let's say black plays the move g6, and white takes and black recaptures with the queen, then white would have the option of gaining a tempo on this queen with the move knight to c3, and that is why black wants to make sure that he is defending his d5 pawn with a pawn. And as opposed to the queen's gambit declined with pawn to e6, the Slav defense leaves black a couple of more options, but it comes with several downsides. So the main difference is when you play the move e6, so developing your king's pawn one square to defend d5, you are blocking in your c8 bishop. When you play the move c6, you don't. It's as simple as that, and this bishop in some cases has the option of developing before you move the e7 pawn to e6, and that's what the Slav defense is all about. I've made a series on the semi-Slav. The semi-Slav is an opening in which black plays both c6 and e6, leaving this bishop on c8. And in many cases, the semi-Slav is more solid than the Slav because your structure with this pawn pyramid or pawn triangle is almost impenetrable. But on the other hand, you are leaving your bishop on c8. The Slav defense, as opposed to the semi-Slav, has one half of the triangle. You can remember it like that. It's not a full triangle. So the Slav has half the triangle, the semi-Slav has the full triangle, leaves the bishop open and gives the bishop more options. So how does black achieve that? White can choose 4 different moves on move 3. White can go knight f3, knight c3, c takes d4, and e3. By far the most popular move is knight to f3. Okay, in this video I'm only going to go through the main variations of the Slav defense briefly. I'm just going to mention them and give you some basic ideas in them. And I'm going to make a separate video on each one, so we are going to cover each one in detail. So if you have any questions about specific variations, the videos are going to be out in the next few days, and you can learn more about them. So after knight to f3, what happens is black plays the move knight to f6, that's the only move and the best move, and white plays the move knight to c3, which is once again the main move and the best move. And now if black plays the move e6, that's going to be the semi-Slav defense. Once again, there's a series on the semi-Slav, you can look at that. That is what I prefer. I prefer the semi-Slav to the Slav because I like the flexibility of it for black. And if black wants to play the Slav defense, there are a few moves he can consider. By far the most popular move is taking on c4. Now, why do you take on c4? You take on c4 because developing your bishop before playing the move e6 is very risky. Let me show you why. Let's say in this position after knight to f3, black doesn't play the move knight f6, he plays bishop to f5, which is seemingly a very natural move. After bishop f5 and of course you wanting to play e6 after you develop your bishop, you already run into some trouble. So if you play the Slav defense, you have to be careful. The main weakness is the b7 pawn, the a4 e8 diagonal, and the b3 square and the b5 square, which white can occupy. So in this position, very early on, black is lost. C takes d5, c takes d5, queen to b3, and you have no better option than to play the move queen b6, and after queen takes d5, well, you lost the pawn, you can on the highest levels you can resign, on lower levels, well, anything can happen. Now let's say after knight f3 black does play the best move. He plays knight f6, white plays the move knight to c3, and black makes this same mistake. Now, I remember making this mistake 3 years ago against Grandmaster Misha Cebalo, who is one of the most famous Croatian Grandmasters. I played him in a blitz game in an unrated tournament. After the game he said, "You have to play e6 here," and he was disgusted with my play. Of course, I don't have to play e6. I can play the normal Slav or the semi-Slav. But a funny mistake which I made, which I would like to point out now, is bishop f5. Black simply doesn't have time to get his bishop out. And now, once again, c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3. What do you do now? Queen b6. Once again, it's a double attack. Knight d5, queen d5, e6. We have the same position. And once again, black's position is busted. Okay, therefore, after the move knight c3, if black doesn't want to go for the semi-Slav with the e6 solidifying his structure, and he goes for the Slav defense, there's a way to ensure that you can develop your bishop to f5, what the Slav defense is all about. This is called the pure Slav or the mainline Slav, when you try to get the bishop out to f5 or g4. In order to do that, you play the move d takes c, as I said, which is the most popular move. If you notice, now the queen doesn't have the b3 square. It's not easy to exploit those weaknesses, and also white doesn't have c takes d5, weakening this diagonal because the pawn is simply no longer on c4. Once white plays his move, and there are several options, white can go for a4, which is the main move. After a4, bishop f5 is played, and now all of a sudden this bishop is outside of the pawn chain, and after e3, e6, black doesn't have to deal with the semi-Slav and French defense problem of the c8 bishop, and this now resembles a Caro-Kann pawn structure, if you notice. If after d takes c4, white doesn't want to go for the main move with a4, he can go for the Geller gambit, which is the move e4, trying to attack the c4 pawn, and now b5 by black. White can also choose to go e3, which is the Alekhine variation, simply wanting to recapture this pawn and going for the safest, probably the safest strategy. Several other moves are possible, like g3, knight e5, and black is forced to know all of them, but this is the main line of the Slav, so if you play the Slav, you're going to learn that. The first video in the series is going to be on the main line, so on this position, where after knight c3, black takes on c4, and we are going to go over all of that in detail. If black doesn't want to go dc4, he can play the chameleon variation, which prepares the move b5, and is fairly flexible once again. Hoping to develop the bishop either to f5 or to g4. In a separate video on the chameleon, I'm going to explain the ideas behind it. But just let me show you that white has two options. White can either go c5, simply by brute force stopping b5, or he can go e3. If he plays e3 and b5 happens, there's no better option but to play b3, and now after bishop g4, once again black has solved his issue. If instead of that he goes for c5, then black has a bit harder job, but developing this bishop and developing his pieces, but there's a strategic plan here which black can go for, and that's going for the e5 pawn break. As soon as this tension has been released, when there is no possibility of c takes d5, the move e5 becomes all that much more powerful, because now if white cannot take on d5, there is no possibility of this pawn being isolated and weak. It's permanently going to be defended by the c6 pawn. So that's the chameleon variation. G6 is the Schlechter variation, which is a sideline which is a good weapon to have up your sleeve, because not many people are prepared for the Schlechter Slav. I actually played that in Blitz a few years ago. Bishop f4, bishop g7, something like e3 and castles, normal positions. So these are the main lines. So after the move knight c3, the semi-Slav is covered in a whole separate series with e6, and we are going to be looking at dc4 in a separate video, we are going to be looking at a6 in a separate video, and we are going to be looking at g6 in a separate video. Okay, now the other lines white can go for are also very interesting. So in the position after d4, d5, c4, c6, one of the trickiest moves for me at least, and for most Slav and semi-Slav players to face, is the exchange Slav with the very early cd and cd, and now either knight c3 or either knight f3 or knight c3 followed by bishop f4, and white simply plays a tempo up in a position that's perfectly equal, but in which that crucial tempo means a lot. So once again, this diagonal is very weak. c6 is weak, b5 is weak, d7 is weak if this knight comes to e5, and there are a lot of tactical problems black could run into if he's not careful, simply because he is one tempo down. So there's going to be a separate video on the exchange variation. And I'm also going to discuss the move knight c3 and the differences with the move knight c3 as opposed to knight f3. So after something like knight f6, most often this move is going to transpose with either something like cd bishop f4 going into the exchange, or simply after knight f6 playing knight f3 going for the same setup where we enter the main line with either dc, or we play the chameleon or the Schlechter. But there are also possibilities if white wants to complicate matters. He could go for something like e3, going for the quiet Slav, and after e6 knight f3 transposing to the same position, or keeping stuff weird for the black player with something like either b3 or queen c2 or bishop d3 or bishop d2 or even a3. So this I'm going to cover simply because you have to be prepared as black to make sure that you don't lose yourself in the move order, to make sure that you don't get confused because black is playing something different to what you know. And I'm sorry, for some reason I played the move e6 here almost instantly because and instinctively because it's what I usually play. Let's play a6, which is the normal Slav, and now he doesn't have to play knight f3 going into the chameleon. He can play something like queen c2 or bishop d3 or something else. So okay, those are the variations that we are going to be covering. So once again, a separate video is going to be made on each one. If you have any questions, please ask. Let me know what you think about the Slav. Let me know which color you prefer if you play it. Do you have the problems with the Slav or against the Slav? I think it's one of the best openings or best defenses to d4. And it's really rich. One of the things that's good about it is that it produces interesting games. You never really know what to expect. It can be positional, it can be tactical, it can be a boring maneuvering 50-move game or a tactical miniature of 20 moves. So that's what I like about the Slav, and that's also a thing that's good for your chess. So openings that are really flexible and really diverse tend to develop your chess better. If you say play the Dutch or the King's Indian all the time, then you're going to be playing similar positions and similar structures, and the Slav can be many more different things, and that's why I prefer versatile openings. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to finish the series on the Slav defense with a very annoying variation white could go for, called the modern Slav. Now, it's not really clear what the modern Slav is. Most people refer to this move queen b3 as the modern Slav, but you could also enter the modern Slav via a different move order, g3, and get to the same situation with queen b3 after something like bishop f5, knight c3, e6, queen b3, which is the same position by transposition. But after knight f6, queen b3, this is what most people call the modern Slav, and it's characterized by a kingside fianchetto for white and the queen on b3. Why is this annoying? Well, first of all, semi-Slav players are unable to play what they usually play. In this position, you can't just go e6 normally because you have no compensation for your bishop on c8, and you basically have a worse position. So you need to be able to react to this. So most novice players in Slav and semi-Slav positions are going to be confused here. Now, just before I start with the theory, I played against this once. It was in the middle of a tournament, so I had time to prepare, and I learned the theory pretty well. I knew everything what I was supposed to do in the first 10 moves. And in the middle game, he outplayed me so easily, because this is the only thing he plays. And he's been playing it for years, and he just knew so many middle game plans, and I didn't have any experience with playing my semi-Slav or Slav against a fianchetto position with a queen on b3. So this requires a lot of experience, and opening theory knowledge will not be enough, which is why I would recommend this as a secret weapon for players with white. I am going to be using the modern Slav. I think it's quite annoying and not too many people know about it. It's sort of a hidden gem which is out in the open. Anybody can use it, but not many people do. Okay, against queen b3, there is only one main move, and that's d takes c4. e6 is playable, it's a sideline, and we are also going to be looking at two quite rare lines with g6 and queen b6. One of them can end up in a pretty interesting variation, so let's look at those two first. g6, I wouldn't recommend. It enters a sort of Schlechter Slav pawn structure with the white queen on b3. So after g6, knight c3, bishop g7, cd, bishop g5, e6, e3 castles. You have the variation of the Schlechter in which you are forced to play b6 at some point because your bishop is on f5 or on g4. Here your bishop is still hemmed in on c8. And as I mentioned in the Schlechter video, after g6, the early queen b3 by white is a very annoying sideline, which, as you can see, transposes to this position. So if you want more variation on this, you can watch the video on the Schlechter Slav. As I said, g6 here I wouldn't recommend because queen b3 I think is annoying as a response to the Schlechter. So after queen b3, why would you play the Schlechter? In my opinion, that doesn't make too much sense. The other line I want to mention as something tricky but not good, in my opinion, is queen b6. Because now white can go for the London system or some other openings. This setup where whoever plays their queen to the b file first is able to then advance their c pawn to force a trade. So in this position, white is able to play this tricky move c5, queen takes b3, a takes b3, and now bishop f5, which is the main move, knight c3. Black needs to play the move knight a6, otherwise he's faced with b4, b5, a minority attack, which can be extremely annoying. And when he plays knight a6, the only way to justify this play after, this is very tricky. The main move here is e4, and e4 tries to exploit the positioning of the black pieces, even though it loses a pawn temporarily. e4, if I have to turn on the engine, if black decides to take it, well, let's see what would happen. The knight is going to hang, so takes, and rook takes here after you capture the bishop. No, let's just take here. Takes. The knight is going to move, and now your c6 pawn is in trouble, your a6 pawn is in trouble, and e4 basically threatens to capture that annoying knight. So after e4, black doesn't have time to take on e4. Black has to do something aggressive. So in this position, after e4, black plays the move knight b4. After knight b4, you are now faced with a knight c2 check, so you need to do something. You play rook a4 to save your rook, and you allow knight c2. And after knight c2, king d2, you might be wondering, well, did I just lose my knight? Well, you did, but you're going to get enough compensation. Knight takes e4, first of all, winning a pawn. Knight takes, bishop d3, trying to exchange some attacking pieces and take the knight on c2. Bishop takes f3, g takes f3, knight takes d4, rook takes d4, e5. And in this position, as you can see, black is a whole bishop down, but he has two pawns for that, and he has induced several structural weaknesses to white's position, so he has more than enough compensation for the piece. Doubled b pawns, doubled isolated f pawns, and an isolated h2 pawn mean that white has almost no useful pawns on the board. The only useful break could be b4, b5, but that's far-fetched. And this huge center and the fact that the rook has to move again give black enough time to develop. So let's just go over that one more time slowly. So after queen b3, in the modern, you can go for queen b6 if you know what you're doing. So c5 is going to be played by most people because this is a very common pattern. Queen takes b3, a takes b3, bishop f5, develop your bishop first. Knight c3, And well, if white tries to push his pawn now, then you can take the b1 knight and be slightly better. So knight c3, knight a6, and now e4, using the knight, using the fact that the pawn cannot be taken, using the fact that white can capture on a6 and win c6 or a6. Knight b4, threatening knight c2 check. Rook a4, stopping, well, not stopping knight c2 check, but not losing the rook. Knight c2 check anyway. King to d2. Of course, if the knight retreats back to a6, then white is going to take it and win. So now after knight c2, we get this tricky variation. Knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4. Bishop d3, bishop f3, ruining the pawn structure. And now knight takes d4, giving up a knight, and e5. To be honest, I would rather be black here. So this may be a new, very interesting weapon I'm going to use when I meet the modern Slav next. But of course it's tricky, and you are a piece down, an experienced player is going to punish this. The engines hate black, but I don't really mind playing this position. I don't think it's easy for white to win, especially in blitz chess or rapid chess. This could be a very viable way to play. Okay, well, and I said queen b6 is not good, but it can be played. Okay, now let's look at this sideline with e6. E6 is not such a good variation because you are closing down the pawn triangle without opening your bishop up to f5. The main move is in the main line, the bishop either goes to f5 or g4. Now white continues with either g3 in the normal modern fashion, or he plays bishop g5, both are playable. G3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, knight bd7, knight c3 is a normal setup, but you have this bad bishop. So what you are going to have to do is you're going to have to play the move b6, and after white captures on d5, you have to take with the e-pawn. You now have to fight to play the move c5 and to open the position up, which either means you're going to be left with an isolated queen's pawn, or that you're going to be sacrificing a pawn. Now, what white wants to do is help you open your bishop up with the move e4, because that blows the position open. So most often, if white knows what he is doing, you're going to be facing the move e4. Rook a1, rook e8, e4. And now, of course, you have to take knight e4, knight e4, d4, knight e5. You can now play the move c5 way more easily, because you are not left with the isolated d-pawn. But you need to be careful because there's a lot of tension on this diagonal, and for the moment white is threatening to take the e4 pawn. If you turn on the engine, well, okay, I just wanted to examine this this idea of playing f5, so moving the king and stopping the spin and playing f5, but you simply don't have time for that because in the meantime white can just capture. So let's say we take here. Pawn takes, attacking the queen defends the bishop, and bishop takes. As you can see, you don't have time to be defending that pawn. The other move after e6 is bishop g5, simply pinning your knight, knight bd7, knight c3 again. White goes for a very, very normal developing plan, and black is stuck with that c8 bishop, trying to play the normal semi-Slav. White got in the move bishop g5 and has no problems. So even though e6 is playable, it's slightly less risky than going for the main line. I wouldn't recommend it. White simply has no problems. Bishop d3, dc4, queen c4, knight d5, takes, castles. I would just prefer to be white here because I don't have to suffer with my bishop. In this line, one of the main ideas is to actually give up the c6 pawn. Okay, white doesn't have to play this tricky move knight e5. This is considered to be the best, to just stop e5, because white was faced with e5 now. Enough defenders. So knight e5 stops that, but after takes, white now has doubled pawns. And black's main idea is b6, giving up the pawn and playing bishop b7. So now you can see how big the issue of the bishop is, which is why I don't like the move the move e6, closing the position down. So instead of that, after queen b3, I would recommend only one move. If you are playing a serious tournament game, and that's the move d takes c4. because this now allows you enough time to open your bishop up to either f5 or g4. Queen takes c4, and now you get to choose. Of course, you want to do that to get the queen away from b7 to make sure you have enough time to develop your bishop. Bishop g4 is a sideline which I wouldn't recommend. Bishop f5 is better and more commonly played, 1500 games from this position. Bishop f5, g3. As I said, this queen b3 and g3 is what makes the modern Slav the modern Slav. Only now you play e6, closing down the structure. Bishop g2, knight b to d7, castles, bishop e7. And here white can either play e3 or knight c3. There are several other moves, but these two are most common. Whichever move white plays, you castle next. And let's say knight c3, castles. You can see that this position is fairly pleasant for black. You don't have a bad bishop on c8. The diagonal for the g2 bishop is kind of blocked for now. The problem is that you are most probably going to be facing the move e4, which is going to either gain space or open the center up with later d5. If white plays the move e3, you castle again, rook to d1. White is bringing all of his pieces to the center, playing against, sort of like playing against the Scandinavian setup where you are trying to force through d5. Queen c7, knight c3, knight d5. What you want to do is control d5 as much as possible, sort of. So you want to provoke him into taking. Of course, if white ever takes, then black is just better in this Carlsbad, because the minority attack is far away from happening. The queen has to move. e4 is not happening. You have a very good bishop pair. Black has a bad bishop on c1, which in the Carlsbad belongs on g5 and traded off on e7, or pinning the knight on g5. So after knight d5, one of the most common maneuvers for white is knight e1, opening up this bishop on the diagonal. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, and now e5 by black. Black needs to play energetically. This pawn center is extremely strong, and you need to be able to break it open. In the other line with knight c3, again, you have to be looking for plans for black, because this is all mainline theory. And when I played that game against the player who plays the modern Slav all the time, we had this position on the board, and he just had way more experience. He played rook to d1, he played knight c3, his bishop, can't really remember where his c1 bishop went. But okay, knight c3, castles, rook to e1, knight to e4, is another plan black could go for, trying to trade the pieces off. Now queen b3 attacking b7, queen b6 defending, knight h4 harassing the bishop. And in this position, black, which is sort of counterintuitive in the Slav or semi-Slav pawn structures like this one, gave up his dark squared bishop to induce structural advantages. So this is a theoretical variation in which bishop takes h4 is played, g takes h4, and knight d to f6, where black has given up his bishop pair for activity on the king side. So even plans like this are possible. My point is, in this position after bishop e7, what you need to do is try to use the fact that your bishop is open. Try to anticipate the move e4. Try to play e5 if you can, because that will bring you a lot more central space. The next thing you want to do is castle and bring your rooks to the center, either c8, d8, or d8, e8. And you need to prevent white from being active. As I said, e4 is going to be one of his main ideas. Knight e1 as well, trying to wreak havoc on this diagonal. Be careful about your b7 pawn. Be careful about your c6 pawn. In fact, be careful, because it's a tricky position. From here, white has a sort of okay score, 29% with knight c3, 37% with e3, even though knight c3 is the more common move. So the modern Slav is a tricky move which you could face. Remember that the best move after queen to b3 is taking on c4, and after queen takes c4, so that you can develop your bishop to f5 without losing the b7 pawn, so bishop f5. g3, you now close the position down with e6. You have completed your Slav Caro-Kann structure with the bishop outside. Bishop g2, knight bd7, white castles, you play bishop e7. And white can now go for either knight c3 or e3. Let's go for e3, which is the best move. You castle. Rook d1, queen e2 can also be played. Queen c7, connecting your rooks, developing your queen, reinforcing b7, reinforcing c6, reinforcing e5. which is the most important reason for that. This is a Sicilian idea, and it comes in many openings where e5 is a good move. Knight c3. After knight c3 comes, you want to fight for d5, you want to fight for e4, so you play knight d5, challenging this knight. The immediate e4 would of course be met with knight takes and bishop takes e4. And now knight e1, trying to exert pressure on this diagonal. And this is what white is going to be going for. What he wants to do is play e4, therefore he moves his knight, he opens up his bishop, and the positions are going to get quite tricky and quite aggressive. And as opposed to the Schlechter, which we saw in the last video, the modern Slav requires you to be very precise. So I would advise you to look at some games by very strong players. From this position, you can look at Mamedyarov Karyakin, 2011, Matlakov Yakovenko, 2011. Very interesting games. Both games won by white, but I prefer to look at games where white won if I'm going to be playing this with black more often, so that I can learn the traps and what to avoid. Okay, with this video we are finishing the series on the Slav. I'm going to be continuing with the Benoni defense, which starts tomorrow. Let me know what you think about the Slav. Let me know if there's any advice about the Benoni you would like me to know before I start. And the first video is up tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching. See you soon. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone. In today's video I'm going to cover the exchange variation of the Slav defense. A variation which most Slav and semi-Slav defense players fear most, hate most, and hate facing most. Not because it's deadly, but because it's boring. There is a phrase, I don't know who said it, that the exchange Slav takes the fun out of the Slav, and that's partially true. Because if both sides know what they're doing, the opening is perfectly symmetrical, it's a draw with perfect play if neither side makes a mistake, and the only difference is that white will always be that one tempo up, and he will always have that first extra move, which will either enable him to make decisions and deviations from the theory and from the regular play of developing pieces, and B, he will always be faster to accomplish what he wants if they keep doing the same thing. So if black just keeps copying white's moves, then white is always going to be one move faster. Okay, now let's get into the opening. After d4 and d5, black plays classically, symmetrically, c4 the queen's gambit, and the Slav c6. White can take the pawn, exchange the pawn, and have a symmetrical position with the tempo up. So he plays c takes d5. One thing I would like to note before we start is that queen takes d5 is not playable, even though it avoids the exchange Slav, because that allows knight c3 with tempo. The queen then either has to go back to d8 or has to go to a5. In both cases, white can just expand with d4 now, and black has taken away a square for his knight on c6. The queen is the only developed piece, and it's kind of misplaced, and white now has a broad center. So against the exchange variation, black simply has to recapture with the c-pawn. One thing I would like to add is that it's possible for white to delay the exchange if he wants to. So after d4, d5, c4, c6, he can play knight f3 or knight c3. And once black plays the move knight f6, which is the most common move here, white can then exchange off. Once again, taking with the knight is not good because e4, you always want to take with the pawn. And now we have a delayed exchange variation, in which white has played knight f3, black has played knight f6. After knight to f3, and if black plays knight to f6, white doesn't really want to play knight to c3, because then he doesn't really have the exchange variation anymore or possibility to enter it, because after black plays the move e6, white takes. Now black is not going to take with the c-pawn, having a bad bishop, he's going to take with the e-pawn, and we are going to have a classical Carlsbad pawn structure with white having a pawn majority on the king side, black having a pawn majority on the queen side, and white is going to go for a minority attack, but that's a topic for a different video. So coming back to the exchange variation, what's the reason players with black don't like it? Well, if white knows what he's doing, and it's not that hard to learn what you should do here, it's impossible for black to gain an advantage out of the opening. It's impossible. And even though that's true with most openings, with the exchange Slav, it's almost impossible to complicate things if white knows what he is doing. So if you want to kill counterplay for black, the exchange Slav is a perfect opening. What both sides can do here is mess up very early on, and there are some possibilities for tricks and quick attacks if you are not careful. But once again, if you learn what you should be doing, it should be fine and safe. I'm just going to show you what the usual game in the exchange Slav looks like. So after d4, d5, c4, c6, takes, takes. I'm now going to show you what's usually played on the highest level. And this video, as opposed to other theoretical videos, is not going to be endless variations in which I talk about what you should do in each. The exchange Slav is a system. It's not an opening full of variations. So it doesn't make sense to learn exact move orders. You need to learn the patterns, you need to learn where your pieces go, and you need to learn how to punish possible mistakes. So, what white wants to do in this opening is develop his pieces, his knights to f3 and c3, his bishop to f4, and then play e3. You don't want to play the move e3 before you've played the move bishop to f4, because then your bishop is going to be trapped on c1. So white starts with knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, both sides develop sensibly, bishop to f4, and black can now choose either e6, which is inferior, or bishop to f5, which is the main move. Now, most games are continuing like this. bishop to f4, e6. Most games are continuing like this after e6, with e3, bishop d6, challenging the bishop. Now in this position, black has challenged the f4 bishop. White has three options. He can take, he can retreat to g3 and take with the h-pawn if black takes, or he can simply develop his bishop, his light-squared bishop to d3 and allow black to take. If black after bishop f4 plays bishop f5, which is a more popular move, now the games are going to look like this. e3, e6, bishop d3, takes, queen takes, bishop to d6, takes, queen takes, castles, castles. Do you notice something in this position? It's completely symmetrical, but white is a tempo up. So what's the point of playing the exchange Slav for white if 100% of the games, believe it or not, from this position, which is fairly common, 93% of the games end in a draw on master level. So what's the point? The point is that you can't have a disadvantage if you play carefully. So it's a risk-free opening on the high level, and especially if black is the higher rated player, it will provoke him to try something risky, and playing something risky always gives white the advantage because he's that one move up. Now, before I go on, I'm just going to show you one common theme in this opening which you need to remember, and that's the problem with the moves queen to b3 and queen to b6, and why they sometimes can, sometimes cannot be played, and how to react to them. Now, I am 5 days late with this video. I wanted to record it 5 days ago, but then I played a training game in the exchange Slav. My opponent played a setup which I didn't know, and that made me think. That setup was after c takes d5. He played the early bishop f4. I played the move knight c6, and he played e3. And I thought, well, I really should be punishing this, and I didn't know how this can be played. I'm just going to show you what I'm talking about. After e3, I played the move queen b6, thinking that, well, since he played e3, his bishop can no longer defend from the d2 square. His b2 pawn is weak. This diagonal is weak. The a5, e1 diagonal is weak. And you can imagine a position in which after black plays the move e5, the bishop could be coming to b4 and the white king could be in trouble. So those were my thoughts. My opponent defended with the move queen d2, which is not bad or terminal, but it just doesn't seem like a good option. And at this point, I thought black had a huge advantage, and that is why I decided to take 5 more days to study the exchange Slav. So in this position, white is in fact perfectly fine. He had an even better option than queen to d2, because queen to b6 is not a threat at all. After queen b6, you can simply play the move knight to c3. And of course, if queen takes b2, you can just take on d5, and there are no problems in this position. As it turns out, after something like e6, white is still not in trouble. In this position, there have been several games played. Bishop d3, a3, and rook c1 have been played. Both are fine. 2 games ended in white's favor, 1 game ended in a draw. So queen b6 in this position was not a threat at all. So that's one situation in which queen to b6 just didn't work, and it looked very tempting. If we look at one of the more popular lines, let's say white tries knight c3 first, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop f4. You might be wondering, well, okay, after bishop f4, white is leaving the b2 pawn undefended. Let's play queen to b6. Well, if you play queen to b6, there's once again absolutely no problem for white. He doesn't have to defend. Now, if you don't know the variations, you might be tempted to play something like rook b1, queen c1, queen c2, queen d2, even retreating the bishop back or playing b3. Now, all of those moves would be unnecessary because you can simply continue with the move a3. And if black takes on b2, you now play knight a4, and black is in serious trouble. After the move queen b5, which is the only move, and now bishop to d2, you are now threatening to trap the queen with the move e3. And if you look at it, it's not that easy to defend this. In fact, the only move is queen a6, otherwise you lose the queen. After queen a6 at e3, black is now forced to play the move b5 to defend the queen, and you simply continue with knight c5. And in this position, if I turn on the engine, you can see that white is clearly winning. So that's just one trap. And if you play the exchange Slav, inexperienced players who don't know the position are either going to waste a ton of time here trying to calculate whether queen b6 works, which I did in my training game after bishop f4 e3, or b, they're just going to play queen b6 thinking they can take on b2, and after they play queen b6 and you play the move a3, which stops bishop b4 and knight b4 and stops the retreat of the queen to a3. If they take, you just win a quick game. Now, another thing I would like to point out, well, why doesn't white try the same thing? After bishop f5, which is the most popular move for black, what's wrong with queen b3 for white? Surely the same variation doesn't work. Well, if black plays the move a6, then queen takes b7 is risky, but black has an even better move. Black can play the move knight to a5 immediately, and now what does the queen do? You can't take. You can play a check on a4 or on b5. In either case, the knight is retreating to c3, to c6. I'm sorry. If you play a check on b5, then even bishop to d7 might be a good move. But okay, queen a4 check is the best move, even though it's a bad move. Knight c6, and now with e3, knight h5, and all of a sudden you've just lost your bishop pair. You are about to be faced with the move b5, and black is not better here. He doesn't have such a winning advantage, but white has wasted a very important tempo on queen b3 and ended up trading off his dark squared bishop, which has now made these squares quite strong for black when he puts his bishop on d6. So those kinds of moves simply don't work. So let's say after bishop f4 and bishop f5, white isn't tempted to play the move queen to b3, which isn't good. He simply plays e3. Now, black should, of course, play the move e6 once again. But once again, let's ask ourselves, well, now the bishop is on f4 and the pawn has been played to e3, which means that it's impossible to retreat the bishop to d2. Why not queen b6 now? Well, if queen b6 now, putting pressure on the pawn, there is a deadly move here for white, and that's the move bishop b5. After bishop b5, it's really not easy to react to this for black. First of all, white is going to castle on his next move, and black needs to do something. The best and the most active move is a6, and now you might be surprised with what the continuation is. You just take on a6 on c6. And now, if the queen takes, that doesn't have to be calculated for a long time, just knight to e5. The queen doesn't have that many squares. After queen to e6, which is the best move, you just play queen to b3, putting pressure on the pawn. You don't have that many options to defend, and all of a sudden, white's position is very dominant. After something like queen to c8, now once again, you can do a lot of stuff. You have a knight on e5, your bishop is on f4, very active. You have a very active knight on c3. You can basically win this pawn on d5 in a couple of moves. If I turn on the engine, this is +3, +2, +3. So you are basically playing for piece activity. And after bishop takes c6, if you play the correct move, b takes c6, then white simply castles. And if, for example, let's say queen takes b2. After queen takes b2, rook c1, white now has knight a4 coming into c5. The c6 pawn is weak. The b file is defended, so the rook never has b8. The knight can come to e5 and win the c6 pawn. Once again, if I turn on the engine, almost a more than +1 advantage for white and a very dominant position. So even after e6, after e3 for white, queen b6 doesn't work. And those are going to be the most common mistakes players make in the exchange Slav, and those are the patterns you need to remember. Whenever you are tempted to play queen b3 or queen b6, or whenever your opponent plays queen b3 or queen b6, try to remember what I was talking about. Usually the move is not that good and it doesn't threaten that much. Okay, now let's look at the main line of the opening. I want to talk about the patterns in the exchange Slav. So after d4, d5, c4, queen's gambit, c6, the Slav, takes, knight c3 is the main move, knight f6, bishop f4. In the main line, you don't play the move knight to f3, you want to keep an option to play e3, knight to e2, because the move bishop g4 can be annoying, pinning your knight. So the main branching of the exchange Slav, if people know what they are doing, is going to revolve around whether white plays knight f3 or knight e2. Knight c6, e3, a6, stopping anything from coming to b5, bishop to d3, bishop to g4, and now if the knight was on f3, the knight would have now been pinned, but now knight g to e2, and of course white now has the option of playing f3 whenever he wants to, and the knights are defending each other. e6, castles, bishop to e7, rook to c1, castles, knight to a4. And this is one of the small advantages white gets in this, what is one of the two main lines in the exchange Slav. Well, you have the c5 square, which is extremely weak. This kind of resembles white's attacking plans in the minority attack. He's going to be using the c5 square either to plant his rook on c5 after knight c5, bishop c5, rook c5 happens, or he's going to try to play for a3, b4, lock down this structure and use both b6 and c5 to his advantage. So something like knight d7 has to be played, stopping the immediate knight c5, a3, rook c8, b4. And now one of the main ways to play this position for black, if you still want to keep equality, is to remember one of the general rules that if your opponent is playing on the flank, you should strike in the center. So here the main move for black is the move e5, which keeps the position balanced and equal. D takes e5, knight d takes e5, and now black is playing with an isolated queen's pawn, which makes the position very complicated. And if you want to play the exchange Slav seriously, here is where you should start studying the opening and start studying the patterns. As a brief introduction, I can just say that any piece trades are going to be favorable for white, because as the pieces get traded down, the isolated queen's pawn on d5 is going to become weaker and weaker. Black, on the other hand, needs to keep the pieces on the board, well, except for maybe he would definitely like to trade this bishop off, because this is a monster, same as white would like to keep it. Black wants to keep most of the pieces on the board and start an attack. Otherwise, as I said, white is just going to trade the pieces off and be slightly better. Okay, so this is the setup which white plays with the move knight to e2, delaying knight f3. And knight f3 after cd5, cd5 is one of the two most popular. Okay, so knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop f4, e6, or bishop f5. Both are fine. I would recommend bishop f5. And now we are looking at what's, I think, most commonly played. From this position, there are 4,000 games in the databases. Of those 4,000, 3,900 have had e3 played here, and 100 have had queen b3, which is a mistake, played here. So e3. Now again, more than 4,000 games with e6, e6, bishop d3, takes, bishop d6, takes, castles, castles, rook ac1, rook ac8, a3, a6. Black is copying white not because he's trying to be funny or trying to provoke white, but because these are objectively the best moves. Both sides have played perfectly thus far, which is why, if I turn on the live book, from this position on, and this is unbelievable, Rook c2, 39 games, 100% ended in a draw. b4, 13 games, 100% ended in a draw. h3, 11 games, 100% ended in a draw. Knight a4, 11 games, 100% ended in a draw. It's really hard to win this because there is no imbalance in the position, there's no advantage for either side. The most common plan here is going to be rook c2, rook fc1, rook c7, rook fc8. White wants to play b4, black wants to play b5, white wants to play knight a4, knight c5, black wants to play knight a5, knight c4. It's insanely symmetrical, and since it's symmetrical, same plans for both sides. When you try one, your opponent stops it or plays it, which still keeps the position symmetrical and equal. So that's the exchange Slav. I hope you didn't mind the kind of new format of the video, not going into tons of variations, but trying to talk about plans, traps, patterns, and ideas. In the opening, I hope you managed to learn something. I know I did in the last 5 days since I played Queen b6 thinking I was much better. I had a long time studying the semi-Slav, and now I think the exchange Slav, and now I think I understand it pretty well. I would be capable of playing it without making a mistake in the opening. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to go over the chameleon variation of the Slav defense, which is the second most popular choice after d takes c4, which is considered to be the main line. Now the chameleon variation is, well, that's at least my interpretation of the name. It's very flexible and very adaptable. So this move a6, the position which you see on the board, can turn out to be many different systems, many different pawn structures, and black can go for several different plans, which I'm going to explain in the video. Okay, if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Slav defense, please watch that first so that you can get an idea of what the opening is about. In that video I've covered the basics and plans for both sides. So how do we get to the chameleon variation? White opens with pawn to d4, we have d5, the classical response by black, and white plays the queen's gambit c4. Black declines it with c6 with the Slav defense, and now we have the two moves which are almost always played, knight f3 and knight c3 by white. So knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and this is where black chooses which variation he's going to play. e6 is the semi-Slav, d takes c4 is the mainline Slav, and today we are going to be looking at the move a6, the chameleon variation. Now what is that move about? As you may have seen in the previous video, in some positions, in some variations, black is going to take the c4 pawn, especially when white fianchettos his bishop to g2. Furthermore, even if white goes for a setup with e3, bishop to e2, or bishop taking on c4, black is now one move closer to defending his extra pawn if he has enough time to take. So in some lines, a6 is going to serve as a defender of the b5 pawn, which in turn is going to defend the extra c4 pawn. So that's one idea. The second idea is, in the Slav sometimes, and in the semi-Slav always, the c8 bishop is a somewhat problematic piece. You can see already in this position, if black plays the move e6, closing down this pawn triangle on the light squares, the light squared bishop is going to be hemmed in. One of the most popular maneuvers in the semi-Slav defense, I'm just going to briefly show it to you so that you know what I'm talking about. So after knight c3, if black plays the semi-Slav, pawn to e6, pawn to e3, knight b to d7, bishop d3 takes, pawn takes, and now black plays the move b5 with tempo. The bishop goes back and black plays the move a6. a6 is a necessary move that black has to play in order to defend b5, in order to be able to play the move c5, which is a liberating break black has to play in order to develop his bishop to b7. And the chameleon variation, the move a6, serves that purpose as well, because in some lines black is going to be closing down the position with e6, and then b5 is going to be a useful move because it's going to be either chasing the bishop away or expanding and preparing the move c5 with b5 defended by a6. Okay, and it's also a waiting flexible move, so it's not committing to anything, which may seem weird. It may seem weird to waste time on a move such as a6, but it does serve several purposes, and it also gives black time to see what white is going to do. Therefore, the chameleon is an appropriate name because black is going to adapt to white's strategy. Now, we are going to be looking at 6 different moves white can play, which is bad news for black because, well, you have to prepare a lot. I'm just going to say that the grandmaster choice is c5, the advanced system, which is, I don't know if it's the best move. Objectively, according to the engines, the best move is g3. But grandmasters play c5 most often. All other 4 moves are also playable, so you can either go c5, e3, a4, cd5, knight e5, or g3. The only move I wouldn't recommend is knight e5, which I find somewhat strange. Now, let's go over the main line c5 first, because that move is kind of funny. On the highest level, I think that if black plays the chameleon and white plays c5, it's highly likely that one side wants a quick draw, and you're going to see why. The main and the only response for black here is knight b to d7. You have to keep developing. And white now plays the move bishop f4. Now, what is the idea? The move c5 is obviously stopping b5. That's the main goal of the move c5. So black has to change his strategy. So black is adapting. So his strategy, as always in the Slav and the semi-Slav, is either to play c5 or e5. Since c5 cannot be played now, black wants to go e5. On the other hand, white wants to go e4, expanding in the center and breaking black's pawn chain. So both sides have ideas of their own. So black is preparing the move e5, white is simply stopping it by developing the bishop to the most natural square. But there is a downside to the move bishop f4. And the downside is black is now able to play knight h5. It doesn't win the bishop. The bishop has several squares it can go to. If it goes to g3, yeah, sure, it's going to be captured. If it goes to e5 as well, and yeah, it's just going to be taken. So the bishop either has to retreat or it has to be defended. And believe it or not, the most common continuation in this variation on move 6 is bishop d2, knight f6, bishop f4, knight h5, bishop d2, knight f6, and they agree to a draw. So that's what happens most often. And that's why I said that if black plays the chameleon and white goes for the main line with c5, it's highly likely that at least one of them wants a draw. Now, if neither of them wants a draw, after the move bishop to f4, black should still play the move knight h5 because it's by far the best move. He can deviate later on. Now, if white plays the move bishop to d2 and black doesn't want to draw, he can try g6, where this knight on h5 is somewhat misplaced, but it's not a bad piece at all. So e4, which can be played now immediately, is a downside of that. D takes e4, knight takes e4, knight d to f6, challenging the knight. Takes, bishop c4 and bishop g7 is a perfectly solid position for black. In fact, I would much rather be black in this position, not because black is better, but because I think it's easier to play when you have this weakness on d4 to exploit. So white has a backwards pawn, which isn't really going to be advancing. And if white manages to develop his light squared bishop soon, then e6, locking in this pawn, and I would even like I would like to trade this bishop for this knight, because all of the pawns are on light squares, and I think in this pawn structure, when all of white's pawns are on light squares, these two pieces are traded off, d4 is weak, I think that white should be in a lot of trouble. So that's how black can avoid the draw. So if bishop d2, black should go g6. If white wants to avoid the draw, he has several ways. One of them is e3, where black can either take the bishop or just leave it on f4, saying that it's not good there and that he can capture it whenever he wants to. So g6 is the most popular move. Taking is also fine. The problem with taking is that you are never really going to be playing e5. So most grandmasters simply leave the bishop on f4. Bishop d3, bishop g7, castles, bishop g5, saving the bishop now. Rook e8, e4, d4, bishop e4, and once again the same problem. And for some reason, strong players choose the move c5. I myself, and this is my subjective opinion, doesn't have anything to do with objective assessments of positions, I would never play c5 because I don't want to play structures with the backwards pawn in which black doesn't have a single target I can exploit. So if you're looking at this position and it's the middle game, what do you do here? With white, I would really struggle to find the plan. Kingside attacks aren't really happening. The knight on h5 is misplaced, but it can come back to f6. I have a hole on d5 in my position, which is a perfect outpost for the black pieces. I have a weak pawn on d4. Sometimes knight takes c5 is a tactic that works. So I don't know. Maybe c5 is a way to draw on the highest level. I just don't like the move. Okay, the other way to avoid the draw for white is the move bishop g5, after which h6, bishop d2, and knight h to f6, the same position we had with repetition, but with h6 interposed for black, and now once again bishop f4. So a draw, if black wants it. And the last option is the move bishop e3, which locks in the e4 pawn, so obviously white is going to be moving his g pawn. So we have g6 and now g4, a fairly aggressive way for white to play, which I agree with. And instead of drawing, this might be a good surprise weapon to the black player, to the player with black who expects a quick draw and a peaceful game. So knight h to f6 and now h3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, castles, h5. And this produces kind of interesting games. And that's it for c5. I really, well, it seems interesting, this move seems interesting, but when you see what it's all about and what both sides have to be playing in order to keep playing the best moves, it's kind of boring. Now, on club level and on anything below master, these games are still interesting. So yeah, my advice is if you want to learn the main line with c5, the main line of the chameleon Slav, look at games which are played by players below 2200. That would be my advice. Okay. The second most popular move is e3. This is a move which says, in my opinion, I don't really want a complicated position. I'm just going to play the most natural move, defend my pawn, stop d takes c and b5, and develop my pieces. Oh, fine. Well, you're blocking in your bishop, so at some point white is going to have to play the move e4, or he's going to have to play b3, bishop b2. Both are okay. Now, you could argue that a6 and e3 are both a waste of time when white plays e3, and that's probably true. b5 by black. Now, taking anyway isn't really that good. If you take on d5, well, c takes. If you take on b5, a takes or c takes would give black huge central control, so b3 is the main move. Bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, castles, knight b to d7. Black has moved his bishop outside of the pawn chain and is developing normally. h3, bishop h5, bishop b2. Nothing is really going on in this position. It's not aggressive. Both sides just develop normally and wait for something to happen later on. Knight e5, a very common maneuver using the e5 weakness. Black has to take on e2, takes. Queen to c7, threatening to win a pawn on e5, and now this neat little tactical trick, cd, and rook c1, where the queen has to move to b1, to b8, and now the knight can take on d7, and black is forced to recapture with the knight. And as you can see, e3 usually leads to a completely symmetrical pawn structure, where the only imbalance is that black's pawns are 2 files farther advanced, and black has a slight space advantage on the queen side. But pawn structures which are completely symmetrical like this, with equal material, so dark squared bishop, knight, 2 rooks, and the queen, on the highest level, the players have basically agreed to a draw at this point. Once again, if you want to learn the e3 system in the chameleon Slav, look at games below 2200, which actually are played on from here and where players don't play perfectly. But e3 is a very peaceful way to play against the chameleon. Okay, now let's look at a more aggressive option, a4. a4 is fun, and a4 serves a clear purpose. White is saying, I'm stopping b5 with 2 pawns, and there's nothing you can do about that. Now, the first thing that has to be explored is what if he takes, what if black takes, white plays the move e4, can b5 be played? Well, no, in this case it cannot be played because knight takes, pawn takes, and rook takes rook. would win material. So a4 definitely does stop the move b5. So black needs to change strategies. And since black has played this flexible move, a6, it's now easier to play both b5 and c5 in the near future, and black can change strategies. He doesn't have to go for a risky bishop development. Something like bishop f5 could run into c takes d, and queen b3. So black can play a peaceful game with e6. Okay, saying that a4 is a waste of time. I have now prepared to develop my bishop, whereas you've played the move a4. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, knight b to d7 defending. And we are going to have a look at a few more moves before we continue with knight b d7, which is the main line. After bishop g5, a very interesting option is a5, similar to the Slav variation in the main line, where the the b8 knight is coming to b4 via a6 using this weakness, whereas white's knight firstly is already developed to c3, secondly the c6 pawn is defending b5. So a5 is not as weakening for white as for black as a4 is for white. White plays e3, knight a6, bishop e2, bishop e7, castles, normal moves, queen b3, and now knight b4. And white's best option is to simply trade the knight off as soon as possible, so something like this, and h6 once again leads to a fairly peaceful position after something like bishop h4, after bishop h4, where black is going to strive to play d takes c, and after bishop takes c to play b5 at the favorable moment, if it's possible. If it's not possible, then he wants to play the move e5. In any case, one of these two have to be played. So either c5, b5, or e5 to liberate the bishop, otherwise black is in trouble. So yeah, but the move a5, I wouldn't really recommend unless you are very familiar with these kinds of systems. I think it's kind of risky, same as the Slav in the main line. And the third option black has is d takes c4, taking the pawn now, and now we are going to see what happens when, e4 is played. Trying to win the knight. And this could run into something similar to the Botevnik. If e5 is allowed, then h6 and white doesn't win a piece. So b5, defending the pawn. And now if e5, h6 is the move, you can watch the video on the Botevnik semi-Slav to learn about these systems. So after b5, a b5, c takes b5, and believe it or not, in this position, after knight takes a takes, black is actually better, and I'm going to show you why. So white has to sacrifice the knight for a pawn, and then he wins the exchange. But black has so much play for the exchange that black is in fact winning after knight b5. A b5, rook a8, and in this position bishop b7 gaining a tempo on the rook, rook a1, h6 chasing the bishop away, bishop to d2, and now knight takes e4. In this position, white has a pawn for the white has an exchange for the pawn, but he has two isolated pawns. Black is going to create a passed pawn on the queen side eventually. Black is the first one to castle in this position because it's really hard for white. White is the first one to castle in this position, but it's really hard for him to defend. After knight c6 castles, queen d5, you can see that all of black's pieces are perfect, and I would say that any single one of these three minors is better than the f1 rook. So it's getting extremely, extremely hard to play. If I turn on the engine in this position, it says that black has -2, which is kind of unbelievable. So that might be a great way to win the positions after a4, and that's the move I would recommend. So, because I think that most players are going to greedily take the exchange. So this is a trick I would recommend that you learn. Now, it's not really a trick, because if DC, e4, b5, ab, cb, if he doesn't take, then black is still fine. The position is still equal. And if he takes, he is in trouble. So let's go over that position once again. So d4, d5, c4, Slav, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, chameleon, a4, e6, bishop g5, which is the main move. If they play a4, they are going to play bishop g5. dc4. After dc4, the only move that compensates for the pawn and tries to win it back is e4, and now we go b5. After b5, I would say that most players who play a4 are familiar that the rook is sometimes hanging, and most of them are not going to know that the exchange sacrifice is more than sound. So play that AB, CB, knight B, AB, rook A8, bishop B7, and black is winning. If you spend a couple of days analyzing positions from here, well, there's only one master game in which, okay, there are 4 master games, 2 draws, 2 wins for black. You can look at all of them. In all of them, rook A1 has been played. And they were played on grandmaster level. One is 2600, the others are 2400, so very high level. Okay, but if you don't want to do that, if you want to play the main line, don't take DC, play knight B to D7, which I once again wouldn't recommend. I would recommend DC. E3, queen A5 is the main move, knight to D2, bishop B4, trying to win the C3 pawn, queen C2 defending, and now C5. And as soon as you can manage the move C5, you have to play it, because that's the way to get your bishop active. You can later on play something like either B6 or B5, bishop B7, and activate your problem piece on C8. Knight B3 attacking the queen, queen C7, DC5. Here the best move is to castle. Taking is also playable, of course, but you are, well, he can take on F6 and ruin your pawn structure. So castling is the main move. You can win that pawn later. Bishop F6, trying to, well, defend the C4 pawn indirectly. Knight F6, C takes D5, knight takes D5, bishop to D3, and now bishop C3, BC3, knight F6. And in this position, white is temporarily a pawn up, but that pawn is going to drop, and it's perfectly equal. I don't like playing the Slav or the semi-Slav for a draw. That's why I wouldn't recommend the move knight B to D7. Okay, instead of A4, C5 or E3, the fourth option is CD5. And CD5 is what I hate facing the most. CD5 is saying, well, I'm white, I'm a tempo up, I'm going to use my small advantage of the delayed exchange Slav, where you have played the move A6. And I think that on grandmaster level, this is one of the main moves and one of the trickiest moves, especially if you spend a lot of time learning the chameleon, learning the plans. This sort of gets rid of all of that. So if you are white and if you are playing somebody who you know is well prepared in the opening, just take on D5, and they are going to be extremely annoyed and their knowledge will have been wasted. Okay, but still, there's a bit you have to know. CD5, bishop F4. And this position is any queen's pawn position with exchanged C pawns. Very common, can happen in a ton of openings, and you've probably played it 1,000 times, but you were unaware of that. And A6 is useful. Okay, A6 stops knight B5. Knight C6, E3. Bishop G4, bishop E2. E6 castles, bishop D6, bishop E7 can also be played. You have to decide if you want a more equal or a more complicated position. Obviously bishop D6 trades the pawns. Okay, so bishop takes D6, queen takes D6. This is a Caro-Kann structure which I've played a lot with the exchange Caro-Kann structure. So I mean, the difference is, yeah, the E3 pawn is on C2, but for black it's an exchange Caro-Kann structure, which I'm very familiar with. So rook C1, castles, knight A4 coming into C5, you have to stop that, knight D7, A3, rook A to C8. This is so boring that it's a draw if both sides play well. You can see that it's equal material, 2 knights, light squared bishop, 2 rooks and a queen. This time pawn structure completely identical. If no mistakes are made, this is a draw. There's no way to create an imbalance. Okay, so I don't want to talk about CD5. If you want to play it as white and simplify positions, sure. If you are black and you play the chameleon, be prepared for a boring game if they take CD5. My advice is look at ideas from the exchange Caro-Kann for black, and with the difference of the C2 pawn being on E3, which is actually an advantage in my opinion, because it's not easy for white to utilize the E-file pressure. Okay, the move that I don't like for white at all, which I think is not a good move, is knight E5. In fact, that's the only move that allows black to equalize. The engine now thinks that the position is equal. You simply play knight BD7, and after bishop F4, well, white played knight E5 to recapture on C4, which is fine. DC, knight c, and now you get the tempo with b5. The knight has to go to e3, and you get to e5, and you get to play bishop b7. Now, this is an improved semi-Slav, in my opinion, after e3, e6, because you are going to play c5. There's no stopping c5. And after bishop e2, c5, castles, cd4, ed4. Why is white playing knight e5? I have no idea. Isolated pawn. All of black's pieces are perfect. Black doesn't have a single issue in the position. They're going to share the c-file. Black's bishop is coming to e7, perfectly natural square. The queen is coming to b6. Rooks are coming to c8 and d8. I would love to play this position. In fact, you can even change plans. You don't have to play queen b6 and stuff like that. You can go knight b6, knight d5, completely blockade and play against the d4 pawn, and that's an isolated queen's pawn, which isn't really that useful. If you want to get rid of any attacking possibilities for white, just snap off the e5 knight, and it's even easier to play. So knight e5, I think, is just a bad move. Don't play it. And now we come to the engine best choice, which, well, the engine best choice is, in my opinion, a good strategy if you understand it. If you don't, you shouldn't play it just because it's the engine best choice, which the proof is after a6, g3 has been played 300 times, c5 has been played 2800 times, e3 2200 times, a4 1800 times. So g3, even though it's the engine best choice, the grandmasters don't trust it. Now what's the idea? g3, of course, prepares to fianchetto the bishop. Black can now play b5 immediately, or he can take on c4. After b5, white plays c5, which closes down the pawn structure, which is okay. g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, castles, knight e5, a5, stopping any queenside expansion, which is okay, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend the trickiest continuation, just d takes c4. Since white is fianchettoing, he's not going to play bishop e3 and bishop takes c4. He's going to play bishop g2. But he has to play the move a4. After a4, he's stopping b5, but now we can go e6, bishop g2, c5, trying to dissolve the pawns, and there's nothing better for white to do than to take. And when this exchange of queens happens, you play knight c6 or bishop d7, and, well, no problems here. You are going to, of course, take the c4 pawn. White is going to eventually take the c5 pawn, and it's going to be equal. Another move you can go for is bishop d7 instead of knight c6, and after knight e3 go bishop c6, challenging this long diagonal, once again winning this pawn later on, where white is going to win your c4 pawn. So knight c4, bishop c5, castles, knight bd7. Once again, symmetrical pawn structure, 4 on 4 and 2 on 2. White is fianchettoed, black isn't. Bishop pair for both sides, no problem for either side, except maybe the a4 pawn for white is slightly overextended, but that's not really a big issue, and the position is equal. So the engine likes it. I really don't see that it's that challenging for black. Okay, so let's summarize the opening. After d4, d5, c4, and the Slav, black plays the move a6, which is flexible, prepares b5, prepares defending the c4 pawn that he can take, but it also allows structures with e6, it allows structures with g6, and many different positions can come out of it. White has several options to play against it. I would recommend the move a4 for white because it's the trickiest. c5 is okay if you want a draw, or if you want to complicate stuff later on with a kingside attack. I would definitely say that knight e5 is a move you should avoid. So as white, look at all 6 options, find one that suits you best. As black, learn all of them. You just have to know all of them. But if you know all of them, your games in the Chameleon are going to be really fun, because as you collect experience, your skill level is going to increase rapidly in the system, because every game is going to be different. Playing the Chameleon really is different every time, as the name says. Well, okay. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think about the opening. Let me know what you think about the video, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stjepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Slav defense with the Schlechter variation, which is sort of the variation of the Slav for the lazy. If you don't want to learn tons of theory, if you want something simple to play with black, then this fianchetto setup is, I would say, the easiest variation of the Slav to learn for black, while at the same time not being the worst. It's perfectly playable, there are no weaknesses, the plans are easy, the piece placements are easy, and in many variations, as we are going to see, you can reach quite pleasant positions. So how do we get to this position? After d4, d5, so the queen's pawn and the classical response, white goes for the queen's gambit, black responds with c6, defending, not going for the queen's gambit decline, but playing the Slav defense. Knight f3, knight f6, knight c3. We come to a crossroads in the position at which black can play a ton of different moves. e6 is the main move going into the semi-Slav, dc4, a6 are two main Slav moves, and g6 is the Schlechter variation, which we are going to be looking at today. Now, what's the idea behind g6? g6 simply prepares to fianchetto the bishop from f8 to g7. That's basically it. Now, with that comes an idea that black may not be obliged to play the move e6, which seems like a good thing, but it doesn't really bring that much to black's position, and black is going to be playing it in most of the cases anyway. Now, what black wants to do, his main strategic goal, and we're going to be seeing a perfect position with that example, is black wants to get rid of that bishop on c8 and then play the move e6. If he can trade this bishop for this knight and close down the position with e6, you can notice that all of his pawns are going to be in light squares, well, except for the a7 pawn. So this bishop was a stupid piece anyway, meaning that this knight is going to be better than this bishop because it's not going to have any scope moving around in black's pawn structure. So this is the idea. In most fianchetto structures, in most fianchetto positions, when black plays the move g6, he doesn't usually follow that up with d6 as well, because that creates tons of dark squared weaknesses, but in this position it's fine, and it's one of the main strategic points. We're going to be looking at 5 different moves that white can play, e3 being, I would say, the most common, with about 4,000 games, when you consider that you could also enter this position from the quiet Slav, which we've been covering in the last video. cd5 is the main pure Schlechter move, and then we also have bishop f4, bishop g5, and queen b3, which are all sidelines not that commonly played. I would like to start with queen b3. We are going to be looking at that from black's perspective. We are going to be looking at all of the positions from black's perspective. So queen b3 simply tries to target the d5 weakness and the b7 weakness, trying to use the fact that black has wasted the tempo on g6. Black ignores that, bishop g7, cd5, cd5, bishop g5 may seem scary, takes and wins the pawn, but now e6, as we said, closing the position down. And this may be one of the worst variations for black from a human perspective, even though it's nothing major. After e3 castles, bishop d3, knight c6 castles, nothing bad has happened, except that this bishop is still bad. And if I turn on the engine, it's going to say that black is equal, and that it's all zeros if you let it sit for a while. But I'm not a big fan of this position, because now I have to figure out what to do with my bishop. And I'm either going to have to do b6, bishop b7, rook c8, and eventually go for e5, or I'm going to have to go for e5 anyway. I don't have my c5 pawn to remove this d4 pawn that's blocking in my bishop. So from this position, there have been 15, 17 games. White won around 60% of them. Most of the others were a draw. So it doesn't favor white that much. So if you're looking for a simple response, if you're looking for a simple response to the Schlechter, I would recommend the move queen b3. It's very seldom played, and it's quite tricky. And what you can be certain of, if black doesn't make a mistake, is that he's going to be equal, but he's going to have a bad bishop on c8. So I would say that queen b3 is quite a good move. I'm just going to show you what the engine thinks should be done after castles, because this is, as I said, hard for humans. So white should be giving up his bishop. Let's say take with the queen. White develops one of his rooks, and now the engine is going to shuffle his rooks around, and I couldn't believe that this position is so good. for black, now bishop b7, and you still have a rough time doing this. Of course, the engine has lined up all of his pieces to push through e5. That means that in this queen b3 line in the Schlechter, you're going to be left with an isolated queen pawn most often, hence rook to d8 to defend d5 in advance. And again, the engines don't find this unfavorable for black, but I think it's just hard to play. For the moment, you have the bishop pair, and you're going to have an isolated queen's pawn, so some advantages, some minuses. Even though with the queens on the board and with the bishop pair, the isolated queen's pawn may be a good lever for an attack, so might not be bad. Okay, but having said that, I think queen b3 is the most annoying move to face. Bishop g5 is the second move I want to look at. That's really not tricky. Just bishop g7, e3, castles, bishop d3, bishop e6, because the bishop has taken up the g5 square. So very often in the Caro-Kann, if you've looked at the videos on the Panov, when there's this structure with d4, c4, and your d5 pawn is threatened, and the bishop goes to g5, you can often play the move bishop e6 using the fact that the f3 knight cannot jump into g5, simply to reinforce d5. Queen e2, knight bd7, castles, h6, bishop h4, dc, bishop c, queen c, and you have used your e6 bishop to trade off white's light squared bishop. Once again, a very solid pawn structure, no weaknesses, and quite simple to play. So against bishop g5, just remember this bishop e6 maneuver and fianchetto and castle as soon as possible. Eventually, when the bishop has developed, so we want to wait for the bishop to go to d3 so that you can take here with tempo, bishop e6, and now that the bishop has been placed on d3, you can safely do this trade of the bishop, and the position is going to be equal. The third move is bishop f4. Both moves, bishop g5 and bishop f4, prepare the move e3, avoiding the quiet Slav ideas of playing e3 when the bishop is still hemmed in on c1. So you can be sure that bishop f4 and bishop g5 are to play e3 and to develop the light squared bishop without placing this c1 bishop behind the pawn chain. You continue in the same fashion, bishop g7. As I said, the Schlechter is extremely easy to play. e3, you castle. These two are going to be your most common moves all the time. Here white can play bishop e2 or h3. h3 is more common, simply to save the bishop, not allow knight h5. Knight bd7, cd, knight d, cd, bishop d3. An equal position in which you can now even go for a queen trade. You don't have to if you are the stronger player. You can do something like b6, bishop b7 if you want to, or you can play rook e8 to prepare e5, or you can play knight b6, you can play knight f6. All moves are playable, but the main move and the best move is queen a5, offering a queen trade, and covering with the knight would remove the knight from the center, so queen to d2 and takes. King takes is the main line, and this should be the definition of equal. Both sides have the bishop pair, both sides have their king side knight, pawn structure, symmetrical. The c-file, the open c-file is going to be shared, and no problems for either side. I would like to have white because he's quicker to occupy the c-file, but that shouldn't be enough, and it shouldn't be any sort of significant advantage. Okay, now we are going to be looking at cd. C takes d5, which is the main move, and e3, which leads to the quiet Slav, or can be achieved from the quiet Slav, which is the most popular. So c takes d5 and c takes d5. Of course, you want to take with the pawn. If you take with the knight, white is going to have an easy game with e4 expanding in the center. Bishop f4, again opening up the bishop before playing e3. Bishop g7, e3. And now we sort of have same ideas that we had here. Where bishop f4 has been played first and then cd5, so this should be the same thing by transposition. So castles, h3, knight c6, we've already seen this position, bishop d3, and cd5 and bishop f4 are highly likely to transpose. As you can see now, again, symmetrical pawn structure. Both sides are going to be sharing the c-file. With a slightly different move order and setup, we have achieved a pretty similar position. In this exact position, black continues with a6 to stop anything from coming into b5. castles, bishop f5, and you might be afraid of playing moves such as bishop f5 because you're going to be doubling up your f-pawns, but in the Slav, in the semi-Slav, and in the Caro-Kann, this is a perfectly playable setup when you have a fianchetto position, because after bishop takes, g takes, you're going to play e6, solidifying your structure. You have given up your light squared bishop, which is great because your pawns are on light squares, and there's no potential for such a quick attack because this pawn setup is actually going to be good in the defense. Knight e5, rook c8, rook c1, e6, queen b3, queen e7, rook f to d1. As you can see, no problems for black. Any sort of kingside attack is far, far away. And the fact that your g6 pawn is on f5 actually helps you restrain white's pieces. At any point, you can allow to trade with knight. You can choose to trade knight e5, bishop e5, knight d7, bishop g7, king g7. That wouldn't lead to anything much. You could continue with rook to g8 and then king to h8. You could start an attack, but no, you don't have that much either. So I just wanted to point out that in these lines, bishop f5, if you want to trade off this more active piece and you don't have a good square for your c8 bishop, and you need to move it because you need to play rook c8 and challenge the semi-open c-file, in Schlechter fianchetto structures, bishop f5 is a perfectly viable move, and exchanging the bishop and bringing your g-pawn to f5 is fine. Okay. Now let's focus on e3, which, as I said, can be achieved by the quiet Slav move order as well. Bishop g7 again, and here white could either go for bishop e2 or bishop d3. In both cases, you want to have the same plan, the same idea that I mentioned earlier. You want to take the f3 knight with your c8 bishop, and you want to play e6. Let's look at bishop d3 first. That's slightly less popular. Castles, castles. So your first two moves were bishop g7 and castles. So you follow up a with b and b with c. You play g6 to play bishop g7 to castle. That's easy. And most often you are going to be facing the move e3 because that's the most common move. Now you continue with the second part of your plan, bishop g4. What you want to do is trade this bishop off. h3, bishop takes, queen takes. Third part of your plan, close the position down. e6, and this is the ideal semi-Slav setup for black. So what you have is a perfect semi-Slav triangle, albeit with the weakness of the g6 pawn being advanced and the bishop being on g7, where I think most semi-Slav players would prefer the pawn on g7 and their bishop on d6, but this is still perfect. And what you want to do now, and yeah, you've gotten rid of your bad c8 bishop. And what you want to do now is simply develop the rest of your pieces, your queen to e7, your rooks to d8 and d8, and play a very solid setup. Rook d1, knight b d7, b3, rook e8, bishop b2, queen e7, bishop f1, rook a to d8. This is perfect classical chess. You have dark squared weaknesses, but you don't have a bad light squared bishop. I would argue that your knights are better than the f1 bishop, either of your knights. And this is, I mean, if I had this position on the board, okay, I have a lot of experience with these types of setups, but I would be so relaxed because it's very hard to go wrong. Strategically, it's easy to play, and white basically has a bad piece he needs to do something about. If it gets back to d3, it's not that useful staring at this wall of pawns. I'm talking about the f1 bishop. And with slight inaccuracy by white, you could start occupying the e4 square with your knights and start wreaking havoc in white's position. If he goes for bishop e2 instead, you do the same thing, castles, castles, bishop g4. The difference is that now white could try to take on d5. He could have done that anyway, but you still don't care. You are still going to go for e6. So cd5, cd5, queen b3 targeting your pawns. Now what you want to do is keep defending both, so b6. h3, you again take, bishop f3, bishop f3, e6, once again completed the semi-Slav, in this case semi-triangle, but it doesn't really matter. Bishop d2, knight c6, queen to a4 attacking your knight, knight a5 and b3, stopping the knight from coming into c4. After queen to a4, rook c8 would of course be a mistake, because then your a7 pawn would be under pressure and moving the knight would lose the pawn. So after queen a4, knight a5 is more precise. because yeah, of course the white knight from c3 could have come to b5 in that case. So once again, you are playing for the same idea, keeping the f3 bishop in white's position slightly worse than your knights. You are playing for e4. You are playing for the c file pressure and no problems in this position. So let's repeat this. So after g6, after the Schlechter, your next two moves are going to be bishop g7 and castle. So e3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles. Your next maneuver is going to be bishop g4. What you want to do is give up this bishop for this knight and close the position down with e6. White could choose to take on d5 or not. Either way, you are doing the same thing. Just be careful if he exchanges and plays queen b3. Make sure you play b6 to defend your pawn and, well, don't lose anything. So the Schlechter Slav, to sum this up, is a very easy variation of the Slav to play for black. It's simple, it's not easy for white to break through, and you very often are going to be playing a very good version of this pawn structure because you are going to have enough time to get your bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e6, allowed by the fact that you play g6, bishop g7 and castle. Therefore, you don't have to play e6 to develop your dark squared bishop before castling, which is the main problem in the semi-Slav. But that's a discussion for a different time. Okay, in the last video on the Slav, I'm going to do the modern Slav, which is extremely annoying. I've played only one tournament game in the variation and lost it. Since then, I've done a lot of work on it. And after that, we are moving on either to the Benoni or to the Queen's Gambit declined, depending on how the tie breaks go in the Patreon vote. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think about the video and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video, I'm going to go over the quiet variation of the Slav defense, which is one of the simplest and easiest Slav variations to learn. And I would say if you're starting out with the Slav defense with white pieces, this could be an easy opening to learn. But one thing should be mentioned, it does avoid a lot of mainline theory and a lot of volatile, double-edged tactical variations which black could go for, which white could go for. So it's not the best choice if you are trying to learn the Slav or the semi-Slav in general. Okay, so we reached this position from the opening move d4, so the queen's pawn opening, d5, black is fighting for the control of the center, not allowing an easy e4 or c4 by white, c4, the queen's gambit, and black declines it with the Slav defense, c6. So now if white chooses to take, black is going to recapture, we have the exchange Slav. If white goes for one of the main moves, knight f3, black responds symmetrically with knight f6, and now by far the most common move is knight c3, after which black would choose e6, a6, taking on c4, a lot of different variations. And here, if white doesn't play the move knight c3, there are basically only two moves which are considered to be good, or theoretically good and playable at the highest level. That's queen c2, which is a very rare sideline, and the other move is the quiet Slav with e3. Now the move e3 is called the quiet variation for a reason. The first downside of the move e3 that you can see is that this bishop is stuck on c1, and it's going to be hard to develop the bishop. Therefore, white is going to be aiming to play the move e4 as soon as possible, and in most variations, as you are going to see, white is going to try to open the position up with e4, or he's going to try to play b3, bishop b2. The second thing, which is quite thematic about the move e3, instead of the move knight c3, is that the move e3 automatically defends the c4 pawn. So many of the variations which we've seen in the semi-Slav series and in the Slav series, where black takes, d takes c4 and tries to hold on to the pawn, are simply impossible here. So from a human perspective, the move e3 is quite simple to play. You are defending your undefended pawn, and you are preparing to develop your bishop. The downside is, as I said, the c1 bishop, but white can live with that. Okay, black has several different options against this move. We are going to be looking at all of them. So the main move is the so-called shallop defense, or bishop f5, which is a move that makes perfect sense. Furthermore, we are going to be looking at e6, bishop g4, a6, and g6. Now, all of these moves have slightly different ideas, but one thing that should be mentioned is that most of these moves lead to semi-Slav positions as opposed to Slav positions. What do I mean by that? I'm just going to illustrate that with the move e6. As soon as black plays the move e6, he has now shut down this semi-Slav pawn triangle, and he is unable to develop his c8 bishop. So in one of the main lines of this variation, white is going to play the move knight c3, transposing to the main line semi-Slav, and this, of course, we are not going to be talking about. I've already talked about this. In this position, black is going to play the move knight b to d7, and white is going to continue with bishop d3. And we have the main line Meran. So after e3, black has several options, but most of them are going to be resembling the semi-Slav instead of the Slav. Okay, the main move, which I want to focus on, and which is, in my opinion, the best move, is bishop f5. Now, why is bishop f5 such a good move? Well, this move simply opens the bishop up, develops it, and puts it outside of the pawn chain before playing the move e6. One thing you may be wondering is the diagonal or the b7 square or this diagonal weak? Well, it's really not. If white plays the move queen to b3, black doesn't have any real issues. Queen b6 can be played without any problems, queen c7 as well, and black is considered to have a small edge in this position. So the move bishop f5 doesn't really leave any considerable weaknesses in the position. Therefore, after the move bishop f5, you could say that black is already winning the opening battle from a classical perspective. He's going to have a better piece, white is going to have a worse piece on c1, but according to the engines and according to grandmaster practice, it's by no means better for black. It's slightly better for white, as most mainline openings. White continues with knight to c3. e6, closing down the pawn triangle. If you play A, you need to follow it up with B. And now the justification for white's play is that if you're familiar with the fact that the bishop pair is worth more than any other combination of the minor pieces, then black is going to suffer because of his bishop on f5. The bishop doesn't have that many squares. It can be captured and rounded up. Now, before I show you the pattern with which white harasses the black bishop, one thing should be noted. This is the so-called semi-Slav or Caro-Kann or Scandinavian defense pawn structure, in which the pawn triangle is on c6, e6 and d5, light squares. Therefore, black's good bishop is the f8 bishop. Usually this bishop is the bad bishop, because in the semi-Slav it's still stuck on c8, and even if you get it outside of the pawn chain, like in the advanced Caro-Kann or in this variation of the Slav, you're not going to try that hard to hold on to it, because, as I said, your pawns on light squares reduce its scope, and you don't mind giving up that bishop, especially if white is going to be wasting some time to do that. So white does that with the move knight h4, of course. In this position, black has two options. He can play the move bishop g6, which is the main move, after which white just takes, which we are going to look at in a second. The other move is bishop e4. After bishop e4, white continues with the move f3, and black now plays bishop g6. Now, the same variation, if white tries to follow the main line, knight takes g6, h takes g6, the position isn't really the same, because, as you can see, white has created quite big weaknesses around his king, and any movement of this knight could bring an annoying check on h4, for example. So when you move the pawns around your king, you make your king weaker. Furthermore, the move f3 has just restricted the h4 knight. So in any event in which the g6 bishop can safely move, this knight is basically unpris at the moment. So imagine that the bishop was on g8 and it's black to move. Black would play the move g5 and trap the bishop. Okay, white now continues with queen b3. Black defends the weakness, queen c7, bishop d2. Usually in the quiet Slav, the bishop is developed to d2 as opposed before playing e4, and if you're not going for, b3, bishop b2, because you want to stop this pin, and in some variations bishop b4 is going to be an annoying pin. Bishop e7, g3. This is not so much to fianchetto your bishop, but to give your knight and escape square, because as you can see, this bishop is now poised to capture the knight. Bishop h5, attacking the f3 pawn. So now in the event of the f knight moving to d7, the f3 pawn would virtually be hanging. So let's say it's black to play again, knight f to d7, bishop takes h4, and bishop takes f3. White now castles queenside, knight f to d7, and now bishop e2, defending the f3 pawn so that black cannot just capture an h4, knight b6. And the variation continues from here. It would be unwise for black to give up his dark squared bishop, his good bishop. White has created kingside pawn weaknesses, but as you can see, black is most probably going to be castling kingside. He is firstly far away from castling queenside. Secondly, the move c5 could be extremely annoying. So moving the pawns around the king side for white may not turn out to be such a bad idea. In this position, there have still been 4 games in Grandmaster play. All 4 have ended in a draw. Okay, and that's the sideline with bishop to e4. By far the more common option is bishop g6, just allowing white to capture the bishop. And now bishop d2, once again stopping this annoying pin with bishop b4. Knight bd7. Well, there's another option. If you don't want to go bishop to d2, and if you try to simply develop your bishop to one of the more active squares, either b2 or playing e4, you could go for g3, knight bd7, bishop g2, dc4, queen e2, knight b6. It should be noted that b5 doesn't work because bishop takes c6. Knight b6 defending the pawn, and the position is once again considered equal. White has a pretty good bishop here. This pawn isn't that safe. a4, a5 can come and the knight can be dislodged. But bishop d2 is more common. Knight bd7, g3 again, bishop e7, b3, e5. Black is trying to open the position up as well. And now we are going to get a bunch of central trades which are going to lead to a perfectly even position, which is on Grandmaster level what you usually get with the Quiet Slav. Because the Quiet Slav got its name for a reason. It's not aggressive. cd5, ed4, ed4, knight d5, knight d5, cd5, bishop g2, knight f6. As you can see, both sides have an isolated queen's pawn. The pawns are blockaded, so there aren't that many attacking ideas with them, and as in normal IQP positions, black is going to castle and nothing much is going on in this position. You could say that white's bishop is slightly more active because it's already targeting the d5 weakness, but on the other hand, white doesn't have a knight on f3 to defend his weakness, so black could be fast to target his as well. So nothing major going on here. The black knight is good because it can come into e4. The white has the bishop pair, but as I said, should be perfectly equal. So that's the move bishop f5. What you want to do with white when black plays this move, trying to get everything he can out of the position, you want to take the bishop pair. Otherwise, black is just going to be slightly better if you allow him to play. So let's say e6 and knight c3, e6, and you play something like bishop e2, and black plays the move h6. And now all of a sudden, black has a good bishop and he's able to save it. So here I would say strategically black is slightly better. He simply has a better minor piece, and you're still far away from playing e4. Okay. The other 4 moves we are going to be looking at briefly. So here, the second most popular move is e6, which, okay, you don't allow this whole maneuver of bishop f5 and knight h4, which is the trickiest and the best for black. You simply close down the pawn chain and go for a semi-Slav. Now, as I said, if knight c3 is played, then you are playing the main line Meran. If bishop d3 is played, then you may still transpose, so after knight b to d7, which is the best move for black. If white now plays knight c3, black is simply going to take on c4, bishop takes c4 and b5, going for the main line Meran once again. Therefore, the Quiet Slav is a way to play the semi-Slav without allowing the main lines. So white simply castles here. dc4 is still the main move, but black now needs to do something about his bishop, and the main move is in fact bishop d6. dc4 can be played, but after bishop takes c4, black doesn't go for b5, that would be too slow. He plays bishop d6, knight c3, castles, e4, and now e5, stopping the central expansion, and in the fashion of the semi-Slav defense, trying to open up the c8 bishop. So as you can see, Experience in the semi-Slav would be way more helpful in the quiet Slav, especially in these e6 variations, because this is a pure semi-Slav position with a slightly different move order, and it seems like one of the two players have messed up the move order in the Meran, but it's in fact the main line quiet, or one of the main lines in the quiet. Bishop g5, queen e7. All the support in this position is going to the e5 point, e5 pawn, d5. Knight b6 attacking the bishop has to move h6, bishop h4, rook d8, rook to e1. White is preparing to recapture on d5 with the pawn, put pressure on the e5 pawn, and the b6 knight is eventually going to have to go to d7. Bishop g4, once again playing around the e5 square, h3, bishop h5, and now g4. And white is forced to make such a positional concession because the e5 square is extremely important, and the bishop on h5 was still pinning the f3 knight to the queen. So now bishop g6, queen e2, once again playing for e5, so that after cd5, ed5, knight bd7, bishop c2, all the control is on the e5 square, and both sides are basically playing around that. Now, you can notice that white has an isolated queen's pawn, and it's already advanced to the d5 square, so structurally that means that it's harder to utilize the pawn for an attack, and that it's more of a weakness, because usually if white pushes the pawn past the fourth rank without dissolving it, then it becomes weaker. So you could imagine something like knight b6 coming into the position and moving the bishop. Something like knight b6, bishop b4, which removes the c3 knight from the defense and opens up the d8 rook, could mean that the pawn is vulnerable. So I'm not a big fan of this variation for white. So if you know how to play it with black, if you know how to play this e6 waiting move, and if you have experience in the semi-Slav, this could be the variation for you, because if white doesn't play actively, this whole central tension thing could backfire. Now, if white doesn't go for these variations with d5, then he is simply acknowledging that he is not going for the best variation possible. He could play something like rook e1. We would have something like rook d8, and now once again d5 is the best move, but white could do something like bishop b3 in anticipation for that. Now e takes d4, knight takes d4, and you're playing sort of a mainline king's pawn opening now with the knight on c3, knight on d4, bishop on b3, something that could come out of the Sicilian or the Philidor for white, I'm saying. So this is easier to play. You don't have an isolated pawn on d5, but black is considered to be equal. Okay, the third move I want to look at is the so-called pin defense or pin variation with bishop g4. As the name says, you are still developing your bishop, but you're not placing it on f5. Now, you may wonder, well, isn't bishop g4 much better than bishop f5? Because now after e6, white doesn't have the move knight h4, winning the bishop. Well, in this position after bishop g4, and this is very important to remember, because most of the finesse in the quiet Slav is going to revolve around black developing or not developing his light squared bishop. So here it's very important that you play the move h3 immediately. Why? Because this either forces the bishop to take on f3, which is in fact the main line. So bishop f3, queen f3, and now you get the Moscow variation of the semi-Slav in reverse after e6. If you know the position with black, you can watch the video on the Moscow. So now white is going to be putting his queen back to d1. In many positions, fianchettoing his light squared bishop on g2 or placing it on e2. And yeah, if this is the main line and black has given up his bishop pair, once again you see that we have reached this point at which black has had to make a concession. So knight c3, knight bd7, bishop d3, bishop b4, castles, queen d1, queen e7, queen to b3, attacking the bishop, dc4, bishop c4, knight b6, attacking the bishop, bishop e2, and bishop d6. And again, white has the bishop pair, but his c1 bishop is horrible compared to the d6 bishop. The d6 bishop is black's best piece. Furthermore, black has the option to utilize the d5 square if it doesn't allow an easy e4. White is going to have a plan of pushing the e4 pawn and going for, well, trying to break through with d5 through this semi-Slav structure. Eventually, that's going to be a late middle game plan, but for now, e4 will serve the purpose of opening up the bishop, because as you can see, moving the queen again and playing b3 and bishop a3 or bishop b2 is going to take a long time. After h3, if black doesn't take the bishop, obviously the other option is bishop h5, trying to save the bishop. And now why is that inferior? In this position after h3, there have been 800 games with bishop takes and 600 games with bishop h5, so most grandmasters choose to take. After bishop h5, knight c3, e6, g4. This bishop is considered to be a bad piece, because once it goes to g6, it's still going to be captured after knight e5. And again, black is losing the bishop pair. So what we can conclude is that if after e3, the quiet Slav, you play the move bishop g4 and white knows what he is doing, you are giving up the bishop pair. So in the quiet Slav, even though white has seemingly made a stupid move, keeping his bishop on c1, he has made sure that black A has to do the same thing and leave his bishop on c8, or B tries to develop the bishop and loses the bishop pair. So white is playing for long-term advantages, and in this position after knight bd7 takes, white has the bishop pair. In both variations, both in bishop f5 and bishop g4, white has had to make structural concessions. So in this case, h3, bishop g4. In bishop f5, he had to play f3, but he has the bishop pair, which is an advantage. Okay, now let's look at two moves with which black tries to do nothing with the bishop, going for the sort of chameleon Slav. If now knight c3 is played, we have the chameleon Slav. We are not going to be looking at that. And if a6, bishop d3, which is the main move, we now have bishop g4, again opening up the bishop. In this case, white doesn't go for the move h3. It's not as necessary. It's much more important to develop his pieces, because his bishop has already been developed on d3. He can go for that later on if he wishes to. And in many positions, the knight will want to come to the g5 square and not to the e5 square, as we are going to see. Knight b to d2, e6, castles, knight bd7, b3, preparing to develop the bishop to b2, bishop d6, most active square, bishop b2, castles, queen c2, supporting the bishop, and looking at the h7 square. And now after queen b8, firstly white has to do something about the h2 pawn, and he also gets a tempo on the bishop. So after h3, defending his h2 pawn, because in some positions, black was threatening to take, and if the other knight is not here to capture the h2 pawn. So now bishop h5, and now knight g5. And in this position with a6, which is considered, of course, to be slower than bishop f5 or bishop g4, white is playing for this activity on the h7 pawn, and after bishop g6, he trades off the bishop with his own d3 bishop, and after g6, he manages to play the move e4. So that's the idea. You're not going for the bishop pair, you are going for the quick e4, opening up the center and claiming a space advantage and a strategic advantage in the center, because as you can see now, white has this huge pawn center and it's going to be hard for black to play around it. The main move, in fact, is bishop f4 for black, and knight d to f3, trying to support his advanced knight some more. After d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, knight f6 can be played to gain a tempo. And of course, as you can see, this central structure is supposed to be giving white an edge. So against a6, white wants to play for the quick e4 as soon as possible, and he doesn't go for the bishop pair if black develops the bishop to g4. Remember with black that if you play a6, you are going to be playing in conjunction with bishop g4, not bishop f5. And remember that if knight c3 is played, you go for b5, which is sort of the main idea in the chameleon defense. You want to expand and open up your bishop as soon as possible, gain space on the queen side. Okay, the last move I want to look at is something similar to the Schlechter Slav. Again, if knight c3, and g6. So let me just show you a slightly different move order. This is a video we are going to be looking at next. So d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, g6. The Schlechter variation of the Slav, we get that same position in which the second most popular move is e3. So now if e3 comes later, after knight c3, we are transposing to the Schlechter. So this we are going to be covering in the next video because the positions simply transpose. After g6, by far the main move is knight c3, and we are now in the Schlechter Slav. So to not spoil the next video, I'm not going to talk about this too much. And you know that if you play the quiet Slav and black plays g6, you are going to be, well, leaving the quiet Slav pretty soon. So 5 options for black to play against this, which gives black quite a big arsenal to add to his repertoire. I would say that the best way to meet the quiet Slav is to play bishop f5, which is the most principled move. You don't really mind giving up that bishop pair if white is going to incur structural advantages. I prefer the move bishop e4 to bishop h5 after knight h4. And bishop f5 leads to interesting positions in which white is going to have to make a concession to get rid of your bad bishop. So that's a good trade in my opinion. Okay, let me know what you think about the video. I still have the modern Slav and the Schlechter Slav to go through. After that, we are continuing either with the Benoni or with the Queen's Gambit declined, depending on how the tie break in the vote goes, because they were tied in the last vote. Okay, let me know what you think. Any comments are appreciated. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to cover the main line of the Slav defense. The main line is probably what you can expect in most games when you are white, if black plays the Slav defense. And the main line is an opening that, well, as you can see on the screen, most variations have a name. And when in a certain opening most variations have a name, you know it's serious and very theoretical and very popular. Okay, so since this is the first video in the Slav series after the introduction, I chose to cover the main line before I cover all the other variations, because I think it's very important to cover that first, because it has all the thematic ideas in the Slav defense as opposed to Queen's Gambit declined or the semi-Slav. Okay. We are going to be looking at several moves for white, first of all. We are going to be looking at 5 responses to the mainline Slav. That means that black, who chooses to play the mainline Slav, has to be prepared for 5 different options. That's very important to note. There are simpler variations in the Slav, so if you choose not to learn that much theory, you could choose a variation in the Slav which doesn't require you to know 5 different responses. Let's get into the opening, and then I'll try to explain this in a bit more detail. So the Slav defense starts after pawn to d4, queen's pawn to d4. Black responds classically with d5, challenging the center. We have c4, the queen's gambit, and we have c6, supporting the d5 pawn, declining the gambit, but not with queen's gambit declined, which is the move pawn to e6, which hems in the light squared bishop, but with c6 defending d5 from the flank. And now, if you haven't seen the introductory video on the Slav, please do. There I explained all the variations or all the options both sides have. Today we are going to be focusing on the main line. So knight f3 by white, knight f6 by black, knight c3 by white. At this point this could still be the semi-Slav or many variations of the Slav defense. But today we're going to be looking only at the move d takes c4, which is considered to be the main line of the Slav, also called the pure Slav. So this move is basically the idea behind the Slav defense, and if you play this, you're going straight into the theoretical battle, most theory-heavy variation of the Slav, which makes most sense and justifies the move c6. Why is that so? Well, if you are familiar with the semi-Slav defense, in which black closes the pawn triangle with e6, you know that you have a problem developing your c8 bishop. In the Slav, as opposed to the semi-Slav, where black doesn't play the move e6, his strategy is going to revolve around making this bishop a good piece and developing it before having to close down the position. Now, the problem with developing the bishop immediately, let's say to f5, is that white now has a very strong option of exchanging the central pawn with c takes d5, and after you recapture, white can simply play the move queen to b3, in which case two of your pawns are attacked because, well, the d5 pawn is defended twice, but if you try to defend your b6 pawn with your queen, you could be in trouble and the pawn would fall. A move like b6 is very weakening, therefore the best move is queen b6, and after this exchange happens, when you take, and queen takes, you are basically a pawn down for nothing. Therefore, the move bishop f5 cannot be played and black needs to do something else. So black has several options. As I said in the Slav, the main option or the main line is to take the pawn, because now you got rid of the option of white taking on d5, and you are now ready to play your bishop to f5 or to g4 or somewhere else, because queen to b3 doesn't exist as a move. Another thing, another advantage of taking on c4 is that, well, white has played the queen's gambit on move 2, and you now delayed the accepting of the gambit, but now you chose to take the pawn, you accepted the gambit, and white is best case scenario going to have to waste time to recapture this pawn. Worst case scenario for white, you're going to be a pawn up and he isn't going to have any compensation. That's a theoretical idea behind taking on c4. So the theoretical idea behind the main line of the Slav is, I want to develop my bishop to f5 or to g4 without having to worry about c takes d5 and queen b3, because neither of those are now possible. Furthermore, I have accepted white's gambit, and he is going to have to take some time for taking the pawn back instead of developing his pieces or castling his king. Okay. We are going to be looking at several different responses by white. Okay, by far the most popular move white could play is a4. This is called the Alapin variation, and that's the most theory-heavy move. We are going to be focusing on that mainly. But white can also play the interesting but dubious e4, which is the Geller gambit. That's for those of you who are aggressive, I would recommend e4. White can also play e3, which, even though it seems less aggressive than e4, actually leads to more tactical, more complicated and more aggressive positions, as we are going to see. Then another move which can be played, but I don't really like it and I wouldn't recommend it, I still want to mention it because you could see that as black, is g3. Now the problem with g3, as you are going to see, is that this bishop, when you play g3, usually goes to g2, in which case you are not really attacking the c4 pawn anymore. So in many variations of the g3 line, the pawn is going to remain on the board on c4 and black is going to be up a pawn. And the last move we are going to be looking at for white is the move knight e5, which once again takes the advantage of the c4 pawn and tries to take it, simply win the pawn back. Okay, let's start. We're going to start with the Alapin variation because that's the most popular and most theoretical line. Okay, what does a4 do? Well, a simple idea behind the Alapin and the move a4 is that white is saying, well, you took my pawn on c4, but I'm going to win it back. Why am I going to win it back? Because you cannot play the move b5. a4 has a very straightforward idea of stopping the move b5. If black now plays b5, we would have ab5, ab5. If cb5, then knight takes b5 and queen a5 check doesn't work because the knight can come back to c3. So b5 would simply lose a pawn. Therefore, black needs to be smart and black needs to do something about that. Most often in Slav and semi-Slav positions, when you take the gambit, when you accept the queen's gambit later on or take the c4 pawn, usually, unless you're playing the Botevnik or the anti-Moscow or some aggressive line where you keep the pawn, usually you are going to give the pawn back for time. So in this case, you have taken the c4 pawn in order to be able to develop your c8 bishop, therefore gaining time for the development of the bishop. So you can consider the move a4 firstly a waste of time because it doesn't develop any pieces. Secondly, it's a positional disadvantage now because it has weakened the b4 square irreparably. So whenever you move a pawn, a square is weakened. Therefore, we are going to see maneuvers such as knight a6, knight b4, where this knight can later on be supported with a5, and this positional disadvantage can be used. Thirdly, the move a4 is a waste of time because black now gets to develop his bishop to f5. So black has managed to achieve something. What did he achieve? Well, he took away from the center, he traded off his center pawn for a flank pawn, which is never a good idea because now, as you can see, the move e4 can be played without being opposed by any pawns. But in exchange for that, he no longer has problems with his c8 bishop. I'm sorry. And the bishop is now outside of the pawn chain. Black is going to be looking forward to the move e6 and playing a perfectly solid structure with c6 and e6, which is hard to break through with d5. So bishop f5 is the most popular response. This is called the check variation. And since the Alapin, the a4 response to the main line of the Slav, has so many different variations, for black I'm only going to be recommending one, which I play, which I prefer, because going through all of them would take way too much time. I'm still going to mention the others briefly. So I would recommend the move bishop f5 because it's the most principled move. Note that it's also the most theory-heavy move. But let's look at the other responses. Another variation black could go for is bishop g4, which develops the bishop to a different square, which seemingly doesn't make a big difference, but it actually does, because firstly, the bishop is now a tempo gain, and that's why I don't like the move. So white is playing the most natural move, knight to e5. And now the idea behind bishop g4 is I want to get my bishop to g6 or to h5 and then to g6. But after bishop h5, white now plays the move f3. And very often in this Steiner variation, the bishop remains on g6 completely locked behind white's pawn chain with f3, e4. Also, you are going to lose your c4 pawn. So bishop g4, if you want to play it, you need to understand it really well. Let me just emphasize, it's not a bad move, it's a good move. But it takes a lot of skill and knowledge to understand it and to play it properly. I think the positions for us mortals who are not grandmasters or very strong players, the positions are easier to play for white. Okay, another variation after a4 is e6, which is called the, I don't know how to pronounce this, Sultan Bey variation. And it gives up the c4 pawn, just concedes to, like, I give up the pawn. I'm not going to fight for it, I'm going to develop normally. And that sort of makes sense. If you don't want to keep your pawn, you should develop. But, and note that Magnus Carlsen has played this position and they couldn't understand this move for a long while. So you took on c4 in order to be able to develop your bishop, and then you play e6, locking the bishop in, which doesn't make that much sense. But black is now going for a semi-Slav position with a different move order, so on a very high level this is a good way to confuse your opponents. I would still recommend that if you are a mortal like me, either play the semi-Slav or don't play e6 against the Alapin, against a4, because it's slightly more complicated, slightly different move order, and you're probably going to complicate your life more than your opponents. And the last variation black could choose is knight a6, which, as I mentioned, exploits the b4 square with the knight. This is called the Smyslov variation, which in my opinion is inferior to bishop f5, and it also requires more knowledge and more positional understanding to be able to exploit a knight on b4. So white is going to play e4, of course, expanding in the center for free. You no longer have your d5 pawn. Bishop g4 pinning the knight, bishop c4 winning the pawn back, and now e6 closing down the structure. Black has achieved this very solid Caro-Kann or Slav or semi-Slav pawn structure with the bishop outside of the pawn chain, which is a great achievement. But I think white's pieces are more active, so the knights are on natural squares. After bishop e3, the bishops are on very good squares. This knight is offside, and not to mention that on a very high level, white is not going to take the a6 knight. But regular club players, and I would say even master level players, could take this knight and try to exploit the fact that, well, you now have two pawn weaknesses which can be targeted, and it's not easy to play with this. Of course, black has compensation for that. Black has the bishop pair, black has a lot of weaknesses in white's position, but I'm not sure which color I'd rather be. So the Smyslov variation with knight a6 is risky business positionally, and if you want to play it, it's definitely less common than the check variation, so it will confuse your opponents, but make sure you understand it. Okay, now let's return to the main move and to the move which I play, which I recommend, bishop f5. As I said, the most theoretical variation is bishop f5, and everybody will know it best, but objectively it's best for black. Okay, since you played the main line, since you took on c4, if a follows b, then dc4, a4, bishop f5 is the only logical continuation. You are using the fact that white has wasted a move on a4, and you are developing your bishop to the most natural square. After bishop f5, we are going to be looking at three different moves for white. The main move is e3, simply trying to take the c4 pawn. The main sideline is knight e5, simply trying to take the c4 pawn with the knight. And one annoying sideline which you need to be aware of is knight h4, which puts pressure on your bishop. Let's look at that first. Knight h4 is a move that gains a tempo on the bishop, but it also wastes a tempo to play knight h4. So, in some variations where black plays bishop c8, which I would not recommend, after e3, you could argue that this knight is worse than this bishop, but also e6 is now not a possibility, because if you play e6, you basically gave up central control with taking away from the center, and you play e6, still keeping your bishop on c8, so e6 would make no sense. Therefore, the theoretical move after bishop c8 is e5, keeping your bishop open and fighting for the center. If d takes e5 happens, then queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and now you gain several tempi. Bishop check, bishop to d2 takes, and knight e4 check saves your knight with tempo. The king cannot approach. So this is something that I would recommend if you are playing somebody much higher rated and they play knight h4. I would recommend bishop c8, because it almost inevitably leads to a queen trade if white knows what he is doing. If he doesn't, then he is slightly worse. Because against much stronger opponents, it's probably good to trade the queens off and have an equal position. Against players you want to beat, I would recommend the move e6. You don't really mind giving up this bishop, so of course white is going to take, so takes. So what did you get? You basically got to play the move e6 with tempo, and white is to move now. After e3, bishop b4, bishop takes c4, castles, knight bd7, queen c2, and g6. I think black's position is perfectly fine. It's really hard to play e4. I don't think white's light squared bishop is such a dominating piece here. Once you play king to g7, it's not even pinning the f7 pawn. I'm not saying that you have to play that, but I really like black's knights in this position, and I really also like this pawn structure, which keeps your king safe. So that's the move knight h4. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just play e6 if you want to win. Play bishop c8 if you want to draw. Remember that e5 is the main move after e3. So it's not such a big deal. Don't be afraid to double your f5 pawns. That's fine. Okay, the other move after bishop f5, which you have to know, which is not the main line, is the move knight e5. After knight e5, white is preparing to recapture your c4 pawn. And now you play the move knight b to d7. After knight b to d7, well, you're trying to develop your pieces and challenge the knight. He's going to take on c4. b5 is not possible in this position because, once again, white is defending b5. So knight b to d7, knight takes c4. Now there are two options. Knight to b6 and queen to c7. Knight to b6 seemingly chases the knight way back to e5, and that's why I don't like that move. I prefer the move queen to c7, which develops a piece. So I'm not going to be going over knight b6. Just to mention it briefly, after the knight comes back to e5, the theoretical move is a5. And this is played on the highest levels, and there is justification for this sort of play by black. Black is trying to exploit d5, c, and c4 as weak squares in white's position with the b6 knight, which is a great piece on b6. But I think it's complicated to play a structure with a5 and b7 because it can often get loose after something like queen b3. Therefore, I would recommend after knight c4 that you simply play queen c7, which is a normal developing move, stopping knight e5 because it can now be captured, and white needs to change strategies. If you play queen c7, what problems do you have? I don't think you have any. The position is perfectly sound. White's main continuation is g3, and now you play for a pawn break in the center as soon as you can achieve it. Even though your bishop is not on c8, if you can disrupt white central control, you should do that. So e5 is the main move, and this is one of the most thematic positions in the main line check when white goes knight e5, which is about 30% of the time. And white usually will not be ready for this, so d takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop to f4 can be simply met with knight f to d7, and I just like this position for black. I think it's very pleasant, very easy to play. And you have a tactical trick in this position which you can play, or you can play simply with something like bishop c5 or bishop e7. I think that the best move here is g5, and if white doesn't know this, this could lead to easy wins. Now, what's the problem? If you take, well, the knight is no longer pinned to the queen, so the knight can take on c4, and the c4 knight is loose. If you take with the knight on e5, then I simply recapture, and your bishop is still on pre. Or if you take with the knight on e5, I take your bishop, which is just simpler, and I should have a more pleasant position with the bishop pair. The main move is knight to e3, which attacks your bishop in return, which I also like for black. So gf4. Knight takes f5, and black now castles queenside. And this is if white knows what he is doing. Who wouldn't want this position with black if they're trying to win? I think this is just perfect. So let's just repeat that. After you get to this position and you play the main line, dc4, and white goes for a4 dialopin, you play the main line with bishop f5, the check variation. White can either play e3, which we are going to have a look at now. He can play knight h4, in which case you should play e6 if you are trying to win, or bishop c8 if you are trying to draw. Or he can play knight e5, against which I would recommend queen c7 and having this very aggressive position with an early e5 and queenside castling. Okay, now let's look at the main line in the check. So after bishop f5, e3 is the most natural move, and you can suppose that most games are going to go like this. Okay, after e3, we have e6, closing down the position, and this is easy because it's natural, so all of these moves are natural, so you can expect this position 90% of the time if you play the main line Slav. So bishop takes c4, bishop b4, also very natural, developing to the best square, castles, castles, queen e2, very natural, knight b7, natural, e4 inevitably has to happen, bishop g6, bishop to d3, and now bishop to h5. And from here, there are several options for white, several options for black. But the main thing is that the main line of the Slav in this check variation is very simple for black to play. If you've ever played the Scandinavian or the Caro-Kann, you're going to be familiar with this structure. If you have your bishop outside of the pawn chain in this structure, you don't really mind having it traded off. I would argue that this bishop is worse than the f3 knight, so trading it off could be beneficial. This knight is jumping into e5, which is always the weakest square in the c6, e6 pawn structure. Therefore, bishop h5 is a good move. And it's just easy to play. So, after the main line and a4, I would recommend the move bishop f5. If white plays e3, you have a solid pawn structure, which is easy to play. If he plays knight e5, well, the position is aggressive for black more so than for white, and if he plays knight h4, perfectly solid with e6. Okay, now let's look at the other options. Let's look at the Geller Gambit. The Geller Gambit is a very aggressive opening, which is unfortunately unsound and just doesn't work. So e4 might remind you of stuff that happens in the semi-Slav, in the anti-Moscow and the Botvinnik variation, where white simply tries to win the c4 pawn back with tempo. The difference is black hasn't played the move e6, so there's never any bishop g5s, which are always played prior to e4 in the Botvinnik and in the anti-Moscow. So black just plays the move b5. And b5 defends the pawn. There's nothing there. e5 is the only attempt, knight d5, simply putting the knight to a good square. And now after a4, e6, everything is defended. If a takes b5, you take on c3 first, b takes, c takes, and black is a pawn up. I'm going to turn the engine on for this one. Black has an advantage. It's not a clear pawn up, it's minus 0.7, but it's just good. And why does white play this? Because he has knight g5 and queen g4 or queen h5, which I don't think is enough. So knight g5 here, and if you don't know it, you should be afraid. But if you know it, you are going to laugh. Bishop b5, queen h5, g6, the queen has to move, queen g4, bishop e7, bishop e2, bishop d5, stopping any tricks on the e6 square, and now it's just a one position for black on the highest level, something like knight c6, knight e4, h5. You can take the knight, you can play h5, queen f4, you can play a5, castles, b4. I mean, there's no problem for black in this position. Castles, everything is defended, you're a clear pawn up, you're going to create the passed pawn and win. So the Geller Gambit, you can play in blitz, you can play in bullet, you can play against inexperienced players. Against good players, don't play it. Against somebody who plays the Slav or the semi-Slav regularly, don't play the Geller Gambit. Okay, another option I would like to mention briefly is the Alekhine variation or the Alyokin variation, where instead of e4, white plays the move e3. It's very semi-Slav-like. That's the thing I like about it for black. It reminds me of the semi-Slav because it leads to imbalanced, complicated tactical positions in which every move counts. It's not clear who is better. It could be any three results, and you could mess up in a matter of two moves and you could just lose the game. Same as after e4, black continues with the move b5, and white now plays a4 immediately. Okay. After a4 undermining the structure, black continues with b4. We have knight b1. Another option is knight a2, which puts pressure on the b pawn immediately, which I think is trickier to meet. You play e6, defending b4 instead of c4. Bishop c4, knight bd7, castles, bishop b7. And this is a semi-Slav problem. You need to play the move c5 to open up your bishop. You played the move e6 before the bishop got out. So this is now a semi-Slav position in which, well, it's similar to the Reynolds attack or stuff like that. Because now you need to solve the problem of your bishop. You also need to defend your overextended b pawn. And, well, you need to play c5 as soon as possible. So queen e2, c5, rook d1, queen b6, bishop d2, a5, knight c1. And I would always prefer to have black here because I've played these positions a million times and I think they are very comfortable. I think this bishop is the best piece on the board. And I think the fact that I have pawns on f7 and d6 is very good for my king. On the other hand, white has castled, white has the b3 square for his knight, and, well, white has a better bishop on d2 as soon as he plays e4. For now it looks hemmed in, but it's going to be active as soon as white manages e4. So that's knight a2 after b4. Knight b1 is the main line, but I would recommend that you play knight a2 if you are white, because now after the move bishop a6 you have successfully defended both pawns. Well, the b4 pawn wasn't even attacked as it is after knight a2. Bishop e2, e6, castles, bishop e7, knight bd2, c3, bc3, bc3, knight b1. You still have the extra pawn on c3, but it's going to drop, and this is going to end up being a very aggressive position for white, in which black has two isolated pawns, white has one isolated pawn, and it should be balanced, but both sides need to be extra careful. Queen a5, defending the pawn, defending everything. Bishop a3 takes, you have to take, rook takes, castles, and now the pawn drops, knight b2 d7. As I said, this is the best case scenario, still very complicated with three minor pieces on the board for each side, but should be equal. And two positions which I would like to mention just briefly, as I said, one of them is g3. After the main line, g3 doesn't challenge the c4 pawn, and it's risky because of that. It requires a deep understanding of the position if you want to play g3, because you're not playing the most logical moves. So for white, I would recommend that you don't play the move g3, because it's hard to play. If you can study it for a long time, study Grandmaster games, understand it very well, then it could be a good weapon, because black could make a mistake and get a worse position. But let's go into the position. So here, black has several options. He can either defend the pawn immediately with b5, he can play g6, copying white but a pawn up, or he can go knight b to d7, which is the most natural move, which I would recommend. They're often going to transpose, and all three moves could be played in all variations. The difference is that after knight b to d7, you don't have to play g6, bishop g7. You can develop your light-squared bishop to g4 or to f5 and then play e6. But I think a fianchetto structure against this is very good. And since I would recommend the fianchetto and all three moves are going to be played, I think you could call all three moves transpositional. Okay, so knight b to d7, bishop g2, g6, castles, bishop g7, e4, it has to be played. Castles, queen to e2, and now b5 and rook d1. And if black knows what he is doing, he is going to be playing this structure. White, of course, has compensation for the pawn. He has a broad center and a lot of central control, but a pawn up is a pawn up. And I'm not sure anybody weaker than master level is going to know how to play this position for white and justify being a pawn down. So against g3, I wouldn't be worried as black. Okay, and the last move I want to look at is knight e5, which is a very straightforward way of targeting the pawn. I don't think it's challenging for black. I think it's a very good test to black if he doesn't know what he is doing, because black has to figure out what to do over the board. But if you've studied this move and once you see this, what I'm about to show you, I think you won't have any problems with it. You can play knight bd7 or b5. One defends the pawn, one doesn't defend the pawn. And you can choose what to do. I prefer the move b5, simply defending the pawn. After b5, white goes for a fianchetto structure once again. And now bishop b7, bishop g2, a6, defending in advance, because now, not in advance, defending from a tactical threat, because now knight takes b5 was a threat, and of course if you take with the c-pawn, bishop takes bishop. Now if knight takes b5, a takes b5, castles, e6, b3 undermining your structure, takes, and bishop e7, and once again black is a pawn up. White has 6 pawns, black has 7 pawns. If black manages to play something like queen c7 and c5, he will be a pawn up with the best bishop in the world that's going to have to be traded off if white wants to, well, survive. And once white trades off the g2 bishop, he's going to have light-squared weaknesses. So pawn up 2-1 on the queen side and getting rid of white's best piece is a huge advantage. So what you need to be playing for as black is queen c7, c5, but that's hard to achieve, and white is not stupid, he's not going to allow that. So white plays bishop b2, castles, knight e4, challenging your f6 knight, which is your best defender at the moment. Also looking at the c5 square, so stopping c5, and if that happens, you are in trouble. So you have to take knight e4, bishop e4, f6 is a risky move, but you need to take action here. And after knight d3, knight to b4 is sort of a threat, so you need to play aggressively. And I would recommend the move a5, or, well, theory recommends the move a5, stopping knight b4, also stopping b4, which you can now meet with a4, creating a passed pawn, and sort of giving up on your idea of playing c5, because it's now very hard to play. But what you will do is you will play knight a6, something like rook b8 or rook c8, queen c7, and c5 later on. Okay, so against the move knight e5, I would recommend that you simply defend your pawn and go for this normal setup with bishop b7 and e6. Leave your bishop on b7, trade off the pawns, and try to play for queen c7, c5, or queen b6, c5. If you don't manage, then play for a5, knight a6. Okay. Let's just recap for a second. So after d4, d5, queen's gambit, c6, Slav defense, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, dc4 is the main line. White can go for a4, e4, e3, g3, or knight e5. a4 is the main move and the most common move. After a4, let's just come back to the Alpin. After a4, you can choose several different moves. I would recommend the move bishop f5. The check variation is the most principled, easiest to play, and most understandable move. Okay, this was a lot of theory. I hope I managed to explain things properly. I know that it's a tough opening and it will take a lot of time to learn, but once you do, the mainline Slav is an extremely powerful weapon in Black's repertoire, and most players with white know how to play against the semi-Slav and easier openings much better than against the mainline Slav. This is sort of challenging white as best as you can, like saying, I want to win, let's see what you have. So if you learn the mainline Slav, you will have gained a powerful weapon in your repertoire against d4. I hope you liked the video. Once again, look at the introduction to the Slav if you haven't seen it, and let me know what you think. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.